I thought I'd survived the worst of my father, 30 years of his cruelty, his mind games, his need to destroy everyone who loved him. I thought burying my mother 10 years ago was the end of his power over me. I was wrong. This Christmas, I made one final mistake. I invited him to dinner. Not out of forgiveness, I'll never forgive him, but because I needed to see something with my own eyes. I needed to watch what happens when a monster finally gets everything he's built his life on, and watches it all crumble in a single night. The dinner table was set. The cameras were rolling. My father had made sure of that, turning our family reconciliation into a PR stunt for his political comeback. And when the food came out looking like something you'd scrape off the bottom of a dumpster, his eyes lit up with that familiar sadistic glee. "This looks like dog food," he announced to the room, his voice dripping with theatrical disgust. "Even a child could cook better than this, Diana." He thought he was humiliating me. He thought this was just another performance where he played the long-suffering father and I played the disappointing daughter. But I just smiled, set down my glass, and said 5 words that changed everything. "I didn't cook tonight, Dad." The clicking of heels on hardwood. A woman's sob from the hallway. And my father's face, for the first time in my entire life, went white with fear, because the real cook was about to walk in, and she was carrying secrets that would destroy him. This is the story of how my father's perfect Christmas dinner became his public execution. And I didn't have to lift a finger. He did it all himself. Part 1. The Christmas Dinner Eruption. My name is Diana Flores. I'm 46 years old, a senior marketing consultant in Manhattan, and for the last 15 years I've built a life carefully constructed around one simple rule: keep my father as far away from me as possible. Until tonight. I stood in my dining room straighting the silverware for the 3rd time, telling myself this wasn't a mistake. The house looked beautiful, I'd made sure of it. Garlands of fresh pine draped the mantel, their scent mixing with cinnamon from the candles I'd placed on every surface. The Christmas tree in the corner glowed with white lights, each ornament positioned with deliberate care. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this dinner, not because I wanted my father here, but because after 10 years of family silence following my mother's death, some relatives had started asking questions. Aunt Marie had called twice. My cousin Jennifer sent a long email about healing family wounds. So I'd extended the olive branch. Not for him. For them. To prove I was the bigger person. To show I'd moved on from my traumatic childhood and become someone who could host a gracious holiday dinner despite everything. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my father had turned my invitation into something else entirely. He'd contacted local media spinning a story about reconciliation with his estranged daughter as part of his latest attempt at a political comeback. I would discover this only when the news van pulled up outside. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. My father has always been punctual. It's one of the few reliable things about him. I opened the door, and there he stood. Harold Flores, 72, still imposing despite his age, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his smile practiced and empty. Behind him stood Emily, his wife of 2 years, a young woman of 28, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Her eyes were downcast, her posture slightly hunched as if she were trying to make herself smaller. "Diana," my father said, his voice booming with false warmth as he swept past me without waiting for an invitation. "What a lovely home. Though I see you still haven't learned about proper hardwood maintenance. These floors should have more shine." He was in my house less than 10 seconds before the criticism began. I swallowed the familiar anger and smiled at Emily instead. "Please come in. Make yourself comfortable." Emily managed a weak smile, but said nothing. She followed my father like a shadow, and something about her defeated posture sent a chill through me. I recognized that posture. I'd seen it before in old photographs of my mother. The relatives arrived in clusters: Aunt Marie with her husband, my cousins and their families, a few family friends I hadn't seen in years. They filled my home with chatter and laughter, carefully avoiding any mention of the obvious tension between my father and me. Harold held court in the living room, telling stories about his business ventures, his voice carrying over everyone else's. I noticed he positioned himself near the front window where the news crew was setting up equipment outside. That's when I realized. The cameras, the reporter adjusting her microphone. This wasn't just a family dinner to him. This was a performance. "Dad," I said carefully, approaching him, "why are there news cameras outside?" His smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Oh, didn't I mention I thought it would be wonderful to document our reconciliation? A heartwarming Christmas story about family healing. The community loves that sort of thing." He lowered his voice so only I could hear. "Don't make a scene, Diana. These people are here. Your relatives are watching. You wouldn't want to embarrass yourself by being dramatic, would you?" The trap was set and I was already in it. Dinner was called. Everyone moved to the dining room where I'd set a table for 14. The china gleamed under the chandelier light. The centerpiece of winter roses looked like something from a magazine. Everything was perfect except for the knot of dread growing tighter in my stomach. When the main course was brought out, I watched my father's face carefully. The dish looked wrong, discolored portions, uneven, a faint metallic smell that made several guests wrinkle their noses. I saw confusion flicker across faces, saw my cousin Jennifer exchange a worried glance with her husband. My father's expression shifted from polite anticipation to barely concealed disgust. He leaned forward, examining his plate as if it were a laboratory specimen. The news camera operator had moved to the doorway lens, pointed directly at our table. Then Harold pushed his plate away with deliberate drama, his voice cutting through the polite dinner conversation like a knife. "This looks like dog food." His laugh was sharp and cruel. "Diana, did you even try? I mean, really try? Even a child could cook better than this." The room went silent. Forks froze midair. My aunt's face flushed with secondhand embarrassment. Emily's hand trembled so badly her water glass rattled against the table. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my reaction. Waiting for me to defend myself, to apologize, to shrink the way my mother used to shrink under his criticism. But I'd been preparing for this moment longer than I'd been preparing for this dinner. I picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down with perfect calm. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, but clear enough for everyone, including the cameras, to hear. "I didn't cook tonight, Dad." His face went blank with confusion, then suspicion, then something that looked almost like fear. The sound of high heels clicking on hardwood echoed from the hallway. Every head in the room turned toward the sound, and Emily began to cry. The clicking of heels grew louder, each step echoing through the frozen silence of the dining room. I kept my eyes on my father's face, watching the color drain from his cheeks as he recognized the sound. He knew exactly who was coming down that hallway, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something I'd never seen before in Harold Flores' genuine fear. Emily emerged from the kitchen doorway, and the collective gasp from my relatives was audible. She looked nothing like the polished, picture-perfect young wife who'd arrived at my door an hour ago. Her honey-blonde hair, which had been swept into an elegant updo, now hung in disheveled strands around her face, some pieces still pinned haphazardly while others fell loose across her shoulders. Black mascara streaked down both cheeks in thick lines, evidence of tears that were still flowing. Her expensive burgundy dress, something that probably cost several $1,000s, was covered in flour, handprints, dark stains that looked like wine or sauce, and what appeared to be smears of something greasy across the front. The white apron tied around her waist was splattered with food in various colors, like an abstract painting of culinary disaster. But it was her hands that made my breath catch. She was gripping the doorframe so tightly, her knuckles had gone white, and I could see her whole body trembling from across the room. Her chest heaved as if she'd been running or sobbing or both. Her eyes were red and swollen, but when she finally looked up and met my gaze, I saw something in them that made my heart clench with recognition. It was the same look I'd seen in my mother's eyes 1,000 times, terror mixed with exhaustion, the expression of someone who'd been broken down so thoroughly they no longer knew how to stand up straight. This wasn't the confident, glowing bride from Harold's carefully curated social media posts. This wasn't the woman smiling serenely in cooking videos, presenting perfectly plated meals with the caption, "My beautiful wife's latest creation." This was someone at the absolute end of her rope, someone who'd been pushed past her breaking point and had nothing left to lose. My father moved fast. He was on his feet before Emily could take another step into the room, his chair scraping loudly against my hardwood floors. He positioned himself directly between Emily and the news camera, his body blocking the lens, his movements sharp and aggressive, despite the smile he was trying to maintain. "Emily." His voice was low, but I caught the edge of steel beneath the false gentleness. "Go upstairs and change. Now." She didn't move. She stood there in the doorway, swaying slightly, staring past him at the ruined meal on the table, at me, at the faces of relatives she'd only met a handful of times, at the camera lens peeking around my father's shoulder. Harold tried again, his smile stretching wider, more desperate. He let out a forced laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Everyone, I apologize for the interruption. My wife wanted to surprise us all with her cooking tonight. She's been taking lessons, you know, but I'm afraid she's not feeling well." He gestured vaguely at Emily without actually looking at her. "Emily, darling, why don't you go rest? I'm sure Diana has something we can order in." "No." Emily's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through his rambling like a knife. The room somehow became even quieter. Aunt Marie had her hand pressed to her chest. My cousin Jennifer's mouth hung open. The news reporter, a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes, leaned forward in her chair with sudden interest. Her camera operator adjusted his angle, zooming in. I watched my father's jaw clench, the muscles in his neck going taut. The cracks in his composure were beginning to show the slight tremor in his hands. The way his smile flickered and died at the edges, the sheen of sweat forming on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. Emily took one shaky step forward, then another. She moved like someone walking through water, slow and effortful, until she was standing close enough to the table that she could see the dishes clearly. Her breath hitched as she looked at them, at the discolored food, the uneven portions, the presentation that looked like it had been assembled by someone with shaking hands and blurred vision. "I tried so hard," she whispered. Those 4 words carried such weight of defeat that I felt my chest tighten. I'd heard my mother say similar things in that same broken tone after another dinner party where nothing met Harold's impossible standards. After another evening where she'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to achieve perfection that could never be reached because my father would always find something to criticize. The relatives exchanged confused, uncomfortable glances. They sensed something terrible happening but couldn't quite grasp what it was. This was supposed to be a reconciliation dinner, a heartwarming holiday gathering. Instead, they were witnessing something that felt like watching a car accident in slow motion. Emily's eyes found mine across the room, and in that moment I saw my mother looking back at me. The same fear, the same defeat, the same desperate, silent plea for someone to see what was happening, to acknowledge the truth that no one wanted to speak aloud. The news reporter shifted in her seat, her expression changing from polite interest to something sharper, more focused. She recognized a story unfolding, something bigger than a simple family dinner. Her pen moved across her notepad in quick strokes. Harold's control was slipping. I could see it in the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides, in the red flush creeping up his neck, in the way his perfect posture began to crack under the weight of his crumbling facade. And then Emily spoke again, so quietly that everyone had to strain to hear her voice breaking on every word. "Harold, you said you wouldn't humiliate me tonight." Harold moved before anyone else could react. He grabbed Emily's arm, not gently, and pulled her toward the hallway that led to my guest bathroom. "Excuse us for just a moment," he announced to the room with that practiced smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. "My wife needs to freshen up." Emily stumbled as he yanked her forward, her heels catching on the edge of the rug. No one at the table moved. They all sat, frozen forks, still suspended over plates, watching this scene unfold with the horrified fascination of people witnessing something they knew was wrong but didn't know how to stop. I stood up. "Dad, maybe we should—" "We'll be right back, Diana. Please serve the salad course." His voice had that edge to it, the one that said, "Don't you dare challenge me in front of these people." The same tone he'd used on my mother 1,000 times. But I wasn't my mother. And I wasn't 16 anymore. I waited until they'd disappeared around the corner, counted to 10, then quietly excused myself from the table. Aunt Marie gave me a concerned look, but I just smiled and gestured vaguely toward the kitchen, as if I needed to check on something. My house has hardwood floors throughout, and I've learned over the years exactly which boards creak and which stay silent. I moved carefully along the wall, staying in the soundless path, until I was just around the corner from where my father had taken Emily. The hallway has a small alcove with a decorative mirror, my mother's mirror actually one of the few things I'd kept from her belongings. I positioned myself behind the wall where I could hear everything but remain unseen. "You stupid, stupid girl." My father's voice was low and venomous, nothing like the booming, jovial tone he'd used in front of the cameras. "You've ruined everything. Do you understand that everything I've been working toward for months?" "I'm sorry, I tried. I really tried." Emily's words came out in a choked sob. "Tried? You call that trying? I needed this dinner to be perfect. I needed footage of you as the devoted young wife, proof that I'm a changed man, a family man. Do you know how important this is for my image? The reporter from Channel 7 is sitting in that dining room right now, and instead of seeing a heartwarming reconciliation, she's watching you fall apart like some hysterical child. Harold, please, I told you I can't cook. I begged you to let us hire someone, but you said it wouldn't look authentic." His voice dripped with contempt. "What's authentic is a wife who cares enough to cook for her husband's family. That's what voters want to see. That's what rehabilitates a reputation. Not some catered meal that screams we're too good to cook for ourselves." "But I'm 3 months pregnant, Harold. I've been throwing up every morning. The smell of raw chicken today made me so sick I could barely—" "I don't care about your morning sickness." Each word was punctuated with barely controlled rage. "You think you're the first pregnant woman to cook a meal? You think that's an excuse? My first wife managed just fine when she was pregnant with Diana, and she never complained once." The lie was so casual, so automatic, that it took my breath away. My mother had been miserable during her pregnancy with me. I'd heard the stories from Aunt Marie. Harold had forbidden her from resting, had demanded she maintain the household perfectly despite severe morning sickness that lasted well into her 2nd trimester. He'd rewritten history so many times he probably believed his own fiction now. "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered. "I've tried so hard to be what you want. All those cooking videos you make me film, the social media posts pretending I'm this perfect housewife when I can barely boil water. Those videos are working. Do you know how many comments we get? What a lucky man to have such a devoted wife. She's beautiful and talented. That's the image we need. That's what gets me back into political circles, what gets me the backing I need." "But it's all a lie, Harold. Every single video is scripted. You stand behind the camera and tell me exactly what to say, exactly how to smile. Sometimes you make me film the same 30-second clip 20 times because my expression isn't right, or my voice sounds too uncertain. I'm exhausted. I can't keep pretending." "You will keep pretending," he hissed, "because you have no choice. Or did you forget about our little arrangement? About what I could reveal about your father if you ever decided to stop being cooperative?" The words hung in the air like poison. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. Blackmail. He was blackmailing her. Of course he was. Emily's sob was muffled as if she'd pressed her hand over her mouth. "You promised you wouldn't use that against me. You said if I married you, if I played the perfect wife, you'd leave my father alone. And I will, as long as you hold up your end. But tonight you've embarrassed me. You've made me look like a fool in front of reporters, in front of Diana's relatives, in front of people whose good opinion I need." There was a pause. Then his voice dropped even lower, more menacing. "Pull yourself together. Fix your face. Go back out there and smile and apologize for not feeling well. Tell them you've been practicing cooking as a surprise for me. Make it sweet. Make it believable. Can you do that, or are you going to fail me again?" I could hear Emily's ragged breathing, could picture her nodding, even though she must have wanted to run. Just like my mother used to nod, used to submit, used to bury her own needs and identity beneath the crushing weight of Harold's demands. The realization hit me like ice water. Emily wasn't just married to my father. She was being used exactly the way my mother had been used, as a prop, a tool, a thing to be displayed and manipulated for his benefit. The pregnancy made it even worse. She was trapped now in a way that would be nearly impossible to escape. Harold had found another woman to control, to break down piece by piece, to transform into a shell of a person who existed only to serve his ambitions. I stepped back slightly, my heart pounding, and that's when I caught a glimpse of the mirror, my mother's mirror, hanging on the wall. For just a fraction of a second in the dim hallway light, I could have sworn I saw my mother's face reflected there instead of Emily's. The same fear, the same exhaustion, the same desperate silent scream for help that no one had answered when she needed it most. But Emily's scream wouldn't go unanswered. Not this time. Not while I was still breathing. I stood frozen in that hallway, staring at my mother's mirror, and suddenly I was 16 years old again, watching history repeat itself in a different woman's face. My mother's name was Catherine. She was a gentle soul, the kind of woman who believed in seeing the best in people, even when they showed her their worst. She had soft brown eyes like mine, and a smile that could light up a room when Harold wasn't around to dim it. But she was never the woman my father wanted her to be. She was too creative, too independent in her thinking, too interested in art and literature, when Harold needed her to be interested in impressing his business associates and political connections. I remember the dinner parties from my childhood with crystal clarity, though I wish I didn't. They were exercises in controlled terror. My mother would spend days preparing, trying desperately to meet Harold's exacting standards, knowing that even her best efforts would likely fall short. He would criticize everything: the temperature of the soup, the texture of the potatoes, the way she'd arranged the vegetables on the serving platter. "Too casual," he'd say in front of guests, as if she were the hired help rather than his wife. "Catherine, really, couldn't you have at least tried to make this presentable?" Each criticism landed like a physical blow. I watched my mother flinch, watched her shoulders curl inward, watched the light in her eyes dim a little more with each cutting remark. She stopped offering her opinions at the table, stopped laughing at jokes, eventually stopped speaking unless directly addressed. She was disappearing, becoming smaller and more invisible with each passing year, and I was too young to understand that what I was witnessing wasn't normal marital friction, but systematic psychological destruction. The worst night came when I was 16. It was their 20th wedding anniversary, and my mother had planned an elaborate dinner party for Harold's business partners and their wives. She'd worked for a week on the menu consulting cookbooks, practicing recipes, desperate to create something that would finally earn his approval. I'd helped her that day, chopping vegetables and setting the table with the good china, watching her hands shake as she seasoned the main course, a complicated fish dish that she'd never attempted before, but Harold had specifically requested. 20 guests filled our dining room that night. The table looked beautiful, candlelit, and elegant, the kind of scene that should have been photographed for a magazine. My mother served the fish with trembling hands, and I remember thinking how pale she looked, how exhausted. Harold took the first bite, and I saw his expression change. The displeasure that crossed his face was almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know him. But I'd learned to read those micro-expressions the way a sailor reads storm clouds. He set down his fork with deliberate care. Then he pushed his plate away and looked around the table at all those expectant faces. "I must apologize to you all," he announced with a regretful smile. "My daughter made this dish tonight. You know how teenagers are always thinking they know better than their elders, always experimenting when they should follow the recipe. "Diana, honey, maybe next time leave the cooking to the adults." The lie was so smooth, so casual, that several guests actually laughed politely. But I hadn't cooked that fish. I hadn't even been in the kitchen when my mother prepared it. I opened my mouth to say so, but my mother's hand found mine under the table and squeezed hard, a silent plea for me to stay quiet. I watched my mother's face crumble, watched her nod and smile and say, "Yes, I should have supervised more closely." Watched her accept blame for my imaginary mistakes, while Harold basked in the sympathy of guests who thought he was being remarkably patient with his incompetent daughter and negligent wife. The humiliation in her eyes was so raw, so complete, that I felt like I couldn't breathe. Several guests looked uncomfortable but said nothing. No one challenged Harold's version of events. No one asked me if it was true. And Harold looked satisfied. That was the part that made me understand finally what he really was. He didn't look angry or disappointed. He looked pleased. Hurting my mother, diminishing her in front of people whose respect she'd worked so hard to earn, gave him genuine pleasure. It wasn't about the food at all. It was about power, about control, about making sure she knew, and everyone knew, that he could rewrite reality however he wanted, and she would have no choice but to nod along. After the guests left, my mother found me in my room. I was crying, furious and helpless in equal measure. She sat on my bed and pulled me into her arms, and I could feel her whole body shaking. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she whispered into my hair. "Why didn't you tell them the truth? Why did you let him blame me?" "Because it doesn't matter what the truth is, Diana. Your father will always make his own truth, and trying to fight him only makes things worse." Her voice was hollow, scraped clean of hope. "But I need you to promise me something. Please don't let him break you. You're stronger than he ever was. You have your grandmother's spine. Don't let him take that from you." I didn't understand then that she was saying goodbye in a way. That she already knew she wouldn't survive much longer in that house under that kind of relentless cruelty. That she was passing something to me, a mission, a warning, a desperate hope that I would be different, that I would escape what she couldn't. From that night forward, Harold's treatment of me changed. He watched me differently, with a kind of cold assessment in his eyes. I looked like my mother, everyone said so. Same eyes, same smile, same stubborn set to my chin when I disagreed with something. But worse than that, I had her independence, her refusal to be molded into his perfect image of what a daughter should be. I wanted to study marketing instead of law. I had opinions about politics that differed from his. I chose my own friends, my own path, my own life. And Harold hated me for it. Because every time he looked at me, he saw the woman he couldn't break the spirit. He couldn't crush the person who would eventually get away from him when my mother never could. I was living proof that his control had limits, and that was unforgivable to a man like him. Standing in my hallway now, listening to him berate Emily the same way he'd berated my mother, I felt something shift inside me. A memory was pushing its way to the surface, something I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't real. But it was real, and it was time to finally face it. The memory dissolved as I heard footsteps. Harold and Emily were returning to the dining room, his hand gripping her elbow in what would look like gentle guidance to anyone who didn't know better. But I knew better. I could see the white pressure marks his fingers left on her skin. I slipped back into the dining room just before they did, retaking my seat as if I'd never left. Emily's face had been hastily wiped clean, though her eyes were still red and swollen. Harold had composed himself back into the genial host that practiced smile firmly in place as he addressed our guests. "I apologize for the disruption, everyone. Emily's been feeling under the weather, but she insisted on cooking tonight as a special surprise. Why don't we move on to the salad course while Diana and I sort out the main dish situation?" His tone was light dismissive, as if nothing significant had just happened. But the reporter from Channel 7 wasn't buying it. I could see it in the way she watched Emily, in the way her pen hadn't stopped moving across her notepad since Emily first appeared in that doorway. She'd spent 20 years in journalism. She knew when she was watching something more than a simple dinner party mishap. Aunt Marie stood up, her motherly instincts overriding social politeness. "Emily, dear, why don't you come sit down? You look like you need to rest." "She's fine," Harold interjected quickly. "Just tired. Pregnancy does that, you know." The word pregnancy hung in the air. Several relatives exchanged glances. This was news to most of them. Emily swayed slightly on her feet, and I moved without thinking. I was beside her in 3 steps, my hand on her arm, gentle, unlike Harold's grip. "Come with me to the kitchen," I said quietly, making it sound like I needed help rather than offering it. I could use a hand deciding what to do about dinner. Harold started to protest, but the reporter spoke up. "Mr. Flores, could I ask you a few questions while the ladies sort things out for the piece I'm writing about family reconciliation?" I saw the conflict play out on his face. He wanted to control Emily to keep her from talking to me alone, but he also desperately wanted that positive press coverage. His ego won, as I knew it would. Of course. I'm happy to discuss our family's healing journey." I guided Emily into my kitchen and closed the door. The moment we were alone, her composure shattered completely. She slumped against the counter, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she gasped. "I ruined everything. Your dinner, your reconciliation with your father." "Emily." I kept my voice gentle but firm. "Look at me. You didn't ruin anything. But I need you to tell me the truth. What happened while you were cooking?" She stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether I could be trusted. Then slowly, she held up her left hand. The bandage I'd noticed earlier was poorly done, already soaked through with blood that had seeped into a dark red stain. "I cut myself," she whispered. While I was preparing the vegetables, Harold was standing right behind me, watching everything I did. He kept telling me I was cutting them wrong, that the pieces were uneven, that I was too slow. His voice was right in my ear, and my hands started shaking, and the knife just... She made a quick slicing motion. It went so deep. The blood went everywhere, into the vegetables, onto the cutting board, into the marinade I'd made. I reached for her hand, carefully unwrapping the gauze. The cut ran across her palm, at least 2 inches long and deep enough that I could see it needed stitches. It was still bleeding sluggishly, the edges of the wound angry and red. "Emily, this needs medical attention. Why didn't you—" Harold wouldn't let me stop. Her voice broke. I showed him the cut, and he looked at it like I'd done it on purpose to inconvenience him. He said, "I cannot disappoint the reporters. You will finish cooking." I told him the food was contaminated with blood, that we needed to start over or order something, but he just kept saying we didn't have time, that everything had to go exactly as planned. I felt ice forming in my chest. "So you kept cooking, while bleeding." He gave me that bandage from the first aid kit and told me to wrap it tight and finish. And then he said... Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He said if the dinner was bad, he'd tell everyone you cooked it, Diana. That you were trying to sabotage his reconciliation attempt because you're bitter and resentful. He had the whole story planned out. But if I told anyone the truth about cutting myself, he'd tell people I was being dramatic and seeking attention. That I was trying to ruin his evening on purpose. The systematic cruelty of it took my breath away. He'd set Emily up to fail, then created a narrative where either she took the blame or I did. Either way, he emerged as the victim of difficult women who couldn't manage a simple dinner party. It was the same pattern, the same sick game he'd played with my mother, but now I could see it clearly for what it was: not spontaneous anger or high standards, but calculated psychological torture. "That's why the food looked and smelled the way it did," I said slowly. "The metallic smell was blood. The discoloration was from contamination." Emily nodded miserably. I tried to cut away the parts that had blood on them, but there wasn't enough food left, and he was watching the clock, rushing me. Everything I made tonight was prepared while I was bleeding and terrified, and 3 months pregnant with morning sickness that won't stop. And he didn't care. He just kept saying his image was more important than... She couldn't finish the sentence. I understood something then with perfect, terrible clarity. Harold's abuse wasn't random outbursts or moments of lost temper. It was methodical, strategic. He created impossible situations, applied pressure until people broke, then blamed them for breaking. He'd done it to my mother for 20 years. And now he was doing it to Emily, a young woman barely past her 20s who'd made the mistake of being useful to his ambitions. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I'd missed it before. But then again, I'd been too young to see it with my mother, too close to the situation to have perspective. And I'd spent 15 years avoiding Harold, building a life away from him, trying to forget. But my mother hadn't wanted me to forget. She'd wanted me to remember, to understand, so that when the time came, the thought stopped me cold. My mother's old belongings, the box she'd told me about in whispered conversations during her final months when she was already so sick. When the time is right, Diana. When you need to know the whole truth. There's a box in my closet hidden behind the winter coats. Promise me, you'll look when you're ready. I'd never looked. After she died, I'd packed up her belongings without really examining them, too grief-stricken to face the memories. The boxes had been in my storage unit for 10 years, gathering dust, and I'd told myself I'd go through them someday when it hurt less. But my mother had left something for me. Something about the truth, and watching Emily stand in my kitchen, bleeding and pregnant and trapped in the same nightmare that had killed my mother, I knew the time was right. I needed to find that box. I helped Emily rewrap her hand with proper bandages from my medicine cabinet, the kind that would actually staunch the bleeding. As I worked, she started talking, the words spilling out like she'd been holding them back for too long. "I need you to understand something," she said quietly, watching me tape the gauze. "I'm not stupid. I know how this looks. Young woman marries rich older man, seems like an obvious gold digger situation. But that's not what happened. Or at least that's not what I thought was happening." I met her eyes. "Tell me." She took a shaky breath. "When I met Harold 2 years ago, he wasn't the man you saw tonight. Or maybe he was, but he hid it better. He'd just lost your mother, and everyone said he was devastated. His business had taken some hits, bad investments, partnerships that went south, a commercial real estate deal that cost several local families their retirement savings. People were angry with him. His name had gone from respected to, well, toxic is probably the right word." I nodded slowly. I'd heard about some of this through the family grapevine, though I'd tried not to pay attention. After my mother's funeral, I'd cut Harold out of my life completely. Aunt Marie would occasionally mention that he was going through a rough patch, but I hadn't cared enough to ask for details. "My father is Senator Richard Chen," Emily continued. "He was leading an investigation into some of Harold's business practices, financial misconduct, fraud allegations, things that could have resulted in criminal charges. I was working at my father's campaign office when Harold came in for a meeting. He seemed so different from what I expected. Humble, apologetic. He talked about how losing your mother had made him reevaluate everything, how he wanted to make amends for his mistakes." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "He was so convincing. Over the next few months, he kept showing up at campaign events, at fundraisers, always with this sad reformed man act. He started asking me to coffee, telling me about his grief, about how he wished he'd been a better husband and father. He said you'd cut him off completely, and he understood why, but hoped to reconcile someday. He made himself seem vulnerable and wounded, and genuinely sorry for his past." I could picture it perfectly. Harold had always been a master manipulator, able to read what people wanted to hear and deliver it with apparent sincerity. "I fell for it," Emily said simply. "I was 26, idealistic, and I believed people could change. My father didn't. He told me Harold was using me, that the timing was too convenient, that men like Harold don't transform overnight. But I thought my father was being cynical, unable to see that someone could genuinely want to be better." She laughed hollowly. "I actually defended Harold to my father. Told him he was wrong to judge someone trying to redeem themselves." "When did Harold propose?" 6 months after we met. And 3 months after that we were married. Small ceremony, very tasteful, very emotional. Harold cried during his vows." Her tone made it clear what she thought of those tears now. Within a month of the wedding, my father quietly dropped the investigation into Harold's business practices. Within 2 months, Harold was being invited to political events, again introduced as Senator Chen's son-in-law. Doors that had been closed started opening. I finished securing the bandage and sat back. And you started to notice things. Little things at first. The way he'd steer conversations with my father toward specific topics, zoning laws, business regulations, upcoming votes, how he'd want to know every detail of my father's schedule, who he was meeting with, what bills were coming up for review. Harold would coach me before family dinners, mention this to your father, or ask him what he thinks about that proposal. I was being used as a messenger, a spy without even realizing it. Emily's hands twisted together in her lap. Then came the social media. Harold sat me down one day and said we needed to build our brand as a couple. He'd hired a social media consultant. We needed to post 3 times a week, me cooking, me decorating the house, me being the perfect young wife. The problem was I couldn't cook. I'd never learned. I grew up with housekeepers, and my mother worked full-time as a lawyer. Domestic skills weren't prioritized in my family. But Harold needed the image, I said. Exactly. So he started directing these elaborate photo shoots. He'd hire a professional chef to prepare the food, then I'd stand there pretending I'd made it. We'd spend hours getting the lighting right, the angle right, my smile right. He'd review every caption I wrote, editing it until it sounded more like him than me. If I suggested posting about my actual interests, I love photography. I used to volunteer at an animal shelter. He'd say it wasn't on brand. The brand was devoted wife who lives to support her husband. I felt sick listening to this. It was my mother's life repackaged for the social media age. The cooking videos were worse, Emily continued. Harold would write scripts, literally scripts. Hi everyone, I'm making Harold's favorite pot roast today. He'd stand behind the camera telling me to smile more, be more enthusiastic, redo that section because I sounded tired. Sometimes we'd film a 30-second video 20 times before he was satisfied. And I couldn't object because he'd say, "This is important for my reputation, Emily, for our future. Don't you want to help me?" He isolated you from your family, I said, recognizing the pattern. Emily nodded. Slowly, subtly. He'd say my parents didn't really understand our relationship, that they still saw me as a child instead of a grown woman making her own choices. He'd pick fights before family gatherings so I'd be too upset to go, then apologize later and say we should have couple time instead. Phone calls with my mother would be interrupted by Harold needing something urgently. My friends gradually stopped inviting me places because I always had to check with Harold first, and usually the answer was no. She looked directly at me, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. It took me almost 2 years to understand the truth. Harold didn't marry me because he loved me or wanted to change or saw me as a person. He married me because my father is Senator Richard Chen. Because that connection could rehabilitate his reputation and give him access to power he'd lost. I wasn't a wife to him. I was an asset, a tool, a key to unlock doors that had closed when his reputation tanked. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, but in the quiet of my kitchen, the words rang out with perfect clarity. He didn't marry me for love. He married me for leverage. The words hung between us, and I saw Emily's expression shift from pain to something harder, more determined. I need to tell you something else, she said, her voice steadier now. Harold made sure I would never come to you for help. From the very beginning, he poisoned the well. I leaned against the counter, giving her my full attention. On our wedding night, he told me about you. About how you were the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned him after your mother died, how you'd spread lies about him to justify your own selfishness. He said you were bitter and jealous of anyone who had a relationship with him. He told me you'd tried to turn other family members against him, that you'd even gone to his business partners with false accusations to ruin him financially. I felt a cold anger settle in my chest, but I kept my face neutral, letting her continue. He showed me emails he claimed were from you, vicious things, accusations of abuse that he said were completely fabricated. He cried while showing them to me, said it broke his heart that his own daughter hated him so much. He warned me that you'd try to manipulate me too, that you'd tell me terrible things about him to poison our relationship the way you'd poisoned his relationship with other family members. He said if I ever talked to you privately, you'd lie to me, try to turn me against him out of spite. Emily's voice cracked slightly. And I believed him, Diana. I'm so sorry, but I believed every word. When Aunt Marie would mention you at family gatherings, I'd feel this defensive anger on Harold's behalf. I thought you were the villain in his story, a cold, heartless daughter who'd turned her back on a grieving widower. So when he said we were coming to your house tonight, I was actually nervous to meet you, afraid you'd say something cruel, try to hurt Harold in front of everyone. But then I walked into that dining room, she continued, and you were nothing like what he'd described. You were calm and composed when he criticized everything about your home. You didn't rise to his bait. And when the dinner went wrong and he exploded, you didn't fight back or get defensive. You just stated a simple fact: you didn't cook tonight. There was no drama, no manipulation, just truth. And I realized... She stopped, swallowing hard. I realized that everything he told me about you was a lie. Because if you were really the person he described, you would have used this moment to attack him. But you didn't. You just let the truth speak for itself. I understood then what Harold had done. He'd created a wall between Emily and me before we ever met, ensuring that the one person who might recognize his pattern and warn Emily would be seen as untrustworthy. It was calculated and cruel, another example of his methodical approach to control. My marriage isn't a marriage, Emily said quietly. It's a gilded cage. I live in a beautiful house where expensive clothes have access to money and status. But I have no freedom. None. Harold controls every aspect of my life. She began listing the ways, her voice mechanical as if she'd catalogued them long ago. He tells me what to wear each day. If I choose something he doesn't approve of, he makes me change, says it's not appropriate for a political wife. He monitors when I wake up, when I eat, when I sleep. He's installed tracking apps on my phone and laptop. He knows where I am every minute. I can't see friends without permission, and he usually says no, claims they're not the right kind of people for someone in our position. My phone is checked regularly. My emails are read. My text messages are reviewed. I felt my hands clenching into fists. The pregnancy is the worst part, Emily whispered. He comes to every doctor's appointment, answers questions the doctor asks me, makes decisions about my care without consulting me. He's already planning the announcement, which week we'll post on social media, what I'll wear in the photos, what caption we'll use. He talks about the baby like it's a PR opportunity. A young family man with a newborn, voters love that, he said. He's already decided we'll do a photo shoot when the baby is 2 weeks old. 2 weeks. I'll have just given birth and he's planning to parade us in front of cameras. Emily's hands moved protectively to her stomach. I'm terrified of raising a child with him, Diana. Terrified of what he'll do to this baby. Will he control them the way he controls me? Will he use them as another prop in his endless quest for relevance? I lie awake at night thinking about it, and I can't breathe. She pulled out her phone, then her movements quick and furtive, as if Harold might walk through the door any second. But I'm not as helpless as he thinks I am. 6 months ago, I consulted a lawyer, used a burner phone I bought with cash, met her in a town 40 miles away where no one would recognize me. She told me something important. New York is a one-party consent state. That means I can legally record conversations without Harold's knowledge, as long as I'm part of the conversation. Emily's eyes met mine, and I saw a spark there I hadn't seen before, something fierce and determined beneath the fear. I've been recording him ever since. Hours and hours of recordings. Him threatening me, insulting me, telling me exactly how to perform for cameras, how to talk to my father, to extract information, what to post on social media. I have him admitting he married me for access to my father's political connections. I have him saying the baby is a strategic asset. I have everything. Why haven't you used them? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Because he threatened my father. Emily's voice shook with suppressed rage. He told me he has fabricated documents, fake receipts, doctored emails, falsified records that make it look like my father accepted bribes and engaged in corruption. He said if I ever try to leave him, if I ever file for divorce or go public with what he's really like, he'll release those documents. My father's career would be destroyed. His reputation, everything he's worked for his entire life. Harold said he'd make sure my father went to prison for crimes he didn't commit. I watched her carefully. Do you believe he'd do it? Yes. The word was absolute, no hesitation. He would destroy my father without a second thought if it meant maintaining control over me. So I've been trapped. I have evidence that could free me, but I can't use it without sacrificing my father. I've been waiting, hoping, praying for some kind of opening, some way out that doesn't end in my family's destruction. Emily looked at me then with something like hope in her red-rimmed eyes. But tonight, watching you stay calm while he tried to humiliate you, seeing that you're not the villain he painted you as, I think maybe finally I'm not alone in this. Maybe there's a way out I haven't seen because I've been too isolated, too controlled, too afraid. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, and the words she spoke next made my blood run cold. He made me film cooking videos, even when I was bleeding. I stared at Emily, my mind racing. Wait here, I said abruptly. There's something I need to get. I left her in the kitchen and moved quickly through my house to the small storage closet off the hallway. My relatives' voices drifted from the dining room where Harold was undoubtedly holding court, spinning his narrative, controlling the story. I didn't have much time. The closet was packed with boxes I'd been avoiding for a decade. After my mother's funeral, I'd taken her belongings from the house I grew up in and stored them here, unable to face sorting through them. The grief had been too raw, too overwhelming. And beneath the grief was something darker, guilt that I'd escaped, while she hadn't anger that she'd stayed so long, confusion about why she never fought back harder. But she had fought back, in her own way. I understood that now. I found the box pushed far back on the highest shelf, exactly where I'd left it 10 years ago. It was an old wooden jewelry box, the kind with intricate carvings on the lid. My grandmother had given it to my mother decades ago. I pulled it down, dust coating my fingers, and sat right there on the closet floor to open it. Inside, wrapped carefully in one of my mother's silk scarves, was a small USB drive. It had a piece of paper tape on it with my mother's handwriting, "For Diana. The truth." My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I remembered now my mother had pressed this box into my hands during one of our last conversations when she was so ill she could barely sit up. "If anything happens to me, check the old box," she'd whispered. "When you're ready, when you need to know, you'll know the right time." I thought she'd been delirious from medication. I thought there was nothing in the box except old jewelry and sentiment. I'd stored it away and tried to forget, tried to move on, tried to build a life that didn't constantly revolve around the trauma of my childhood. But my mother had left me something. A message. Evidence. The truth she couldn't speak aloud while she was alive. I grabbed my laptop from my bedroom and brought both items back to the kitchen. Emily looked up as I entered, her expression questioning. I held up the USB drive. "My mother left this for me before she died. I never looked at it. I think it's time." I plugged the drive into my laptop, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The drive contained 2 audio files. The first was labeled "The Truth About Harold." I clicked it, and after a moment of static, my mother's voice filled my kitchen. I hadn't heard her voice in 10 years. The sound of it hit me like a physical blow. Emily's hand found mine and squeezed as tears began streaming down my face. "Diana, my darling." My mother's voice was weak, hoarse, barely above a whisper. She'd recorded this near the end when the illness that would kill her had already taken so much. "If you're listening to this, then I'm gone. And there's something I need you to know. Something I could never tell anyone while I was alive because I had no proof, and Harold would have destroyed me for saying it. But I can't go to my grave without leaving you the truth." She paused, and I could hear her labored breathing. "I believe Harold has been poisoning me. Not quickly, he's too smart for that. slowly over many years. Small amounts of something that the doctors can't detect because they're not looking for it. Every time I tried to leave him, every time I stood up for myself or threatened divorce, I would become mysteriously ill within days. Severe nausea. Dizziness so bad I couldn't stand. Weakness that left me bedridden. The doctors ran every test imaginable and found nothing conclusive. They said it was stress or anxiety or psychosomatic. But I knew, Diana. I knew. My mother's voice strengthened slightly, fueled by determination. I started noticing patterns. After our fights, when I'd finally work up the courage to tell him I was leaving, I would drink my evening tea and within hours feel terrible. It happened too many times to be coincidence. I became afraid of the food in my own home. I started making my own meals, but Harold would insist on bringing me tea when I was upset, saying he wanted to comfort me, and I'd be sick again. Always sick when it was most convenient for him. Sick when I'd planned to pack my bags. Sick when I'd scheduled consultations with divorce lawyers. Sick when I'd finally found the strength to fight. I heard Emily gasp softly beside me. My own breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. "I have no proof," my mother continued. "Nothing that would hold up in court. But I know what I've experienced, and I know Harold. He doesn't want to lose control. Divorce would mean losing his image, his access to our social circle, his comfortable life. And he's smart enough, careful enough to find a way to keep me trapped without leaving evidence. So he's killing me slowly, Diana. Destroying my health bit by bit so I'm too weak to leave, too sick to fight, too worn down to do anything but exist in this prison he's created." Her voice cracked. "If I die, it wasn't natural causes. It was Harold. It was years of whatever poison he's been feeding me. And I need you to know that, to understand that, so you never doubt yourself about leaving him. You got out, Diana. You're free. Don't ever go back. Don't ever let him convince you to give him another chance. And if you see him doing this to another woman—" She broke off, coughing. "Please stop him. Please don't let another wife suffer the way I've suffered. Promise me." The recording went silent for a moment. Then my mother's voice returned, softer, now fading. "I love you more than anything in this world. You were the light in my darkness. Don't let him extinguish your light the way he extinguished mine. Find the truth, Diana. Find the proof I never could. Make sure he can't do this to anyone else." The file ended. The kitchen was completely silent except for the sound of Emily and me crying. My mother had been murdered. Not in a single violent act, but slowly, methodically, over years. Harold had poisoned her to keep her compliant, to prevent her from leaving to maintain his control. And when she finally died 10 years ago, the death certificate had said heart failure. Natural causes. No investigation. No questions asked. I thought about Emily, pregnant and trapped, already showing signs of morning sickness that wouldn't stop. I thought about the control Harold exerted over what she ate, what she drank, every aspect of her physical health. History was repeating itself, and this time I had the chance to stop it. With trembling hands, I clicked on the second file, for Diana. Open when ready. My finger hovered over the second file for a long moment. Some part of me knew that once I opened it, everything I understood about my identity would change. Emily watched me silently, giving me space for whatever was coming. I clicked the file. My mother's voice returned even weaker than before, as if recording these words was taking the last of her strength. "Diana, there's one more truth you must know, and this one will be the hardest. I've carried this secret for your entire life, and I'm so sorry I never had the courage to tell you while I was alive. But you need to know. You deserve to know." She paused, and I could hear her gathering herself. "Harold is not your biological father." The words didn't register at first. I heard them, but my brain couldn't process what they meant. Emily's hand tightened on mine. "I was in love with someone else before Harold," my mother continued, her voice thick with emotion. "His name was Robert Chen. He was kind and gentle and everything Harold wasn't. We were planning to marry, but my family, your grandparents, they had other plans. They'd promised me to Harold, who was older established, from the right kind of family. Robert was an immigrant son, still building his career not acceptable to them. They forced me to break off the engagement with Robert and marry Harold instead. I could hear tears in her voice now. But I was already pregnant with you when I married Harold. I was 6 weeks along. I thought Harold didn't know, thought I could pass you off as his if you came a few weeks early. And for 3 years it worked. You were my beautiful secret, the part of my first love that Harold couldn't touch. But then you got sick when you were 3, needed blood work at the hospital, and the blood type didn't match what Harold expected. He got suspicious. He secretly did a DNA test. My mother's voice hardened. When he found out the truth, I thought he'd divorce me. Part of me hoped he would, honestly. But Harold didn't want a divorce. He wanted revenge. He sat me down and told me, "I will make you pay for this betrayal every single day of your life, and I'll make sure that bastard child never knows happiness. I'm going to stay in this marriage and destroy you both slowly. You'll watch me tear her down piece by piece, and you'll know it's your fault for lying to me." I felt like I couldn't breathe. Emily was crying beside me, but I was beyond tears, trapped in a state of shock that felt almost like numbness. Every cruel word he said to you, Diana, every criticism, every comparison that made you feel worthless, it was all revenge. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you existed. Because every time he looked at you, he saw Robert Chen, the man I actually loved. He saw evidence of my betrayal. You were living proof that I'd loved someone else, that I'd been forced into marriage with him, that he was my second choice. And he couldn't stand it. My mother's breathing was labored now. He hated you for having Robert's eyes, for having my smile, for being independent and strong-willed like we both were. Everything about you reminded him that he was the husband I'd been forced to accept, not the man I'd chosen. So he tried to break you the way he broke me. Every time you showed confidence, he tore it down. Every time you succeeded at something, he found a way to diminish it. Every time you were happy, he found a way to steal that happiness. It was systematic, calculated psychological torture, and you were just a child who didn't understand why your own father seemed to hate you. I realized I was shaking violently. Emily had her arm around me, holding me up. "But Diana, my darling, you need to understand something crucial." My mother's voice gained strength, became fierce despite her weakness. "Harold is not your father. Not in any way that matters. You don't carry his poison in your blood. You don't have his cruelty in your genes. You are mine and you are Robert's. You were born from real love, not from the forced marriage and resentment that defined my life with Harold." Her voice softened again, tender now. "Robert was a good man. He would have been a wonderful father if we'd been allowed to be together. He had integrity, kindness, genuine compassion. Those qualities are in you, Diana. I see them every day. You're not Harold's daughter, you never were. He has no real claim to you except legal paperwork that means nothing. The DNA you carry, the person you've become, that's all from Robert and me. From love, not from Harold's hate." I heard my mother take a shaky breath. "You are free of him, Diana. Free of his legacy, free of any obligation to him. You don't owe him forgiveness or reconciliation or another chance. You are my legacy, not his. You are everything good that I tried to preserve in that house of darkness. Don't let his cruelty steal your light. Don't let his shadow follow you anymore. You were born from love, real genuine love, and that's what you carry forward. Not his poison. Never his poison." The recording went silent. My mother's last gift to me. The truth that she'd been too afraid to speak while alive, the secret she'd carried for over 40 years. The revelation that explained everything about why Harold had treated me the way he did. I wasn't his daughter. I had never been his daughter. Every moment of cruelty, every criticism, every attempt to destroy my confidence, it had all been revenge for a betrayal I hadn't committed, for a love story I'd had no part in, for existing as evidence of my mother's heart belonging to someone else. Emily was saying something, her voice gentle and concerned, but I couldn't process words yet. I was reeling, my entire understanding of my identity shifting. All those years I'd thought there was something wrong with me, something that made me unlovable to my own father. All those years I'd wondered what I could have done differently to earn his approval. And the truth was, there was nothing I could have done. Because I wasn't the problem. I never had been. My phone buzzed on the counter, startling both of us. A text message from an unknown number. I opened it with shaking hands. "Hi Diana, this is Rebecca Shaw from Channel 7 News. Harold mentioned we'll be filming the family introduction segment in 30 minutes. Will you be available? Looking forward to capturing this beautiful reconciliation story." I stared at the message. Then I looked at Emily, still crying silently beside me. Then at my laptop, where my mother's USB drive contained evidence of poisoning abuse and decades of calculated cruelty. Harold thought tonight was going to be his triumphant return, his redemption story. He thought he'd manipulate another performance control, another narrative, rebuild his reputation on the backs of women he'd trapped. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd invited cameras to document his victory, and those same cameras were going to document his downfall. I wiped my face and stood up, something hardening inside me. Emily looked at me with concern, but I shook my head. "We need to go back out there," I said quietly. "But first, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Emily nodded without hesitation. "After everything you just learned, you're still thinking clearly enough to have a plan." "Yes, I trust you." "Good. Because we're going to end this tonight. Not with shouting or accusations, but by letting Harold be exactly who he is. The cameras will do the rest." We returned to find the living room transformed into a film set. Harold had clearly been busy while Emily and I were in the kitchen. The news crew had set up professional lighting reflectors positioned to cast him in the most flattering glow. A camera on a tripod was aimed at the chair he'd positioned in the center of the room, and another camera operator stood ready for candid shots. My relatives had been herded to the edges of the space, arranged like an audience for Harold's performance. And Harold himself stood in the middle of it all, reviewing notes for his speech, every inch the confident politician preparing for his moment. He'd changed into a different jacket, something that photographed better. His hair had been touched up. He held himself with the bearing of a man who believed he'd already won. "The lighting is still wrong," he barked at the camera operator, a young man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "I need the key light higher. Are you even a professional? And where's my water?" I asked for water with lemon, not lime. "Lime is too bitter." An assistant scurried away to fix the water situation. Harold turned his attention to the furniture placement, moving a chair 3 inches to the left, then back to the right, then diagonal. Nothing was quite right for his vision. Then he noticed Emily and me standing in the doorway. His expression shifted immediately, the irritation smoothing into practiced warmth. "There you are, Emily, darling. Come stand here next to my chair. We'll get some shots of us together looking like the devoted couple we are." He gestured impatiently when she didn't move fast enough. "Quickly now, we're on a schedule." Emily walked forward slowly, and I followed a few steps behind. Harold positioned her next to him, then stepped back to assess the composition as if she were a piece of furniture. "No, that's not right. You need to look more adoring. Tilt your head slightly toward me like you're gazing up at me with respect. And smile, for God's sake. You look like you're at a funeral." He demonstrated the expression he wanted, his smile wide and fake. "Like this. Can you manage that?" Emily attempted the smile. It looked pained. "Better, though, still needs work. We'll fix it in the actual filming. Diana, you'll stand over there." He pointed to a spot slightly off camera. "Close enough to be included if we need family shots, but not so close that you dominate the frame. This is about reconciliation, but I'm the story here. The magnanimous father welcoming back his prodigal daughter. You understand." I nodded, saying nothing. My silence seemed to please him. He interpreted it as submission, as acceptance of my role in his narrative. From my position, I could see everything. Harold conducting his orchestra, arranging his set pieces, crafting his perfect moment. My relatives watched uncomfortably, sensing something off about this orchestrated production, but not quite able to articulate what. The reporter, Rebecca Shaw, stood near the back with her notepad, and I studied her face carefully. She was older than I expected, maybe late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that were watching Harold with an expression I recognized. It wasn't admiration or neutral journalistic observation. It was assessment, possibly even recognition. My mother had said she had no one to tell about the poisoning, no one who believed her. But she'd had friends. Women she'd confided in, trusted with pieces of the truth, even if not the whole story. And Rebecca Shaw had the look of someone who'd been waiting a very long time for this moment. I caught her eye across the room. She gave me the smallest nod, so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. But I saw it, and I understood. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to be here, not just for a puff piece about family reconciliation, but because she sensed there was a bigger story lurking beneath Harold's PR veneer. Harold was too focused on his staging to notice these small exchanges. He was in his element, commanding the room, certain of his control. He'd spent weeks planning this, I realized. The dinner invitation, the news coverage, the timing, all of it calculated to rebuild his image on the backs of Emily and me. He genuinely believed we would play our parts because we always had. Emily had been playing her part for 2 years. I'd been playing mine for decades until I'd finally escaped 15 years ago. But tonight, we weren't going to follow his script. We were simply going to let him perform. I moved quietly to Emily's side and placed my hand gently on her arm. She turned to look at me, and I leaned close to whisper in her ear. "I'm going to stand beside you tonight. No matter what he says, no matter what he does, I won't let him hurt you anymore. You're not alone." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly before Harold could notice and criticize her for ruining her makeup. She squeezed my hand in silent gratitude. Harold was conferring with the camera crew, explaining exactly how he wanted the opening shot framed. His assistant returned with the correctly prepared water. The lighting was adjusted one more time. Everything was being arranged to his exact specifications. He turned back to us, clapping his hands together with satisfaction. "Perfect. We'll start filming in 5 minutes. Remember, everyone, this is a heartwarming story about family healing. Big smiles, positive energy, and Diana, try not to look so severe. You're supposed to be happy about our reconciliation." Then he walked over to Emily, gripped her shoulder in what would look like affection to the cameras, but I could see was uncomfortably tight, and said in a voice loud enough for the room to hear, "Tonight, Emily, you will smile no matter what happens." It wasn't a request. It was a command layered with threat, delivered with absolute confidence that she would obey. But I saw the change in Emily's expression. The fear was still there, but underneath it, something else was hardening. The same thing that had hardened in me when I listened to my mother's recording. Harold had made his final mistake. He'd gathered witnesses. He'd invited cameras. He'd created the perfect stage for his redemption. And he was about to discover that the women he'd spent years breaking were not as broken as he believed. The cameras were positioned. The lights were bright. My relatives settled into their assigned spots. And I stood there watching Harold orchestrate his redemption, feeling something crystallize inside me that had been forming since I first heard my mother's voice on that recording. I didn't need to destroy Harold. I didn't need elaborate schemes or dramatic confrontations. I didn't need to match his cruelty with cruelty of my own. I just needed to step out of the way and let him destroy himself. Years of therapy, years of processing my childhood trauma, years of rebuilding my sense of self, all of it had taught me something essential about men like Harold. Their greatest weakness is their own nature. When they feel secure, when they believe they're in control, they reveal exactly who they are. They can't help it. The mask slips because they stop believing they need to wear one. Harold had spent decades manipulating situations, controlling narratives, orchestrating outcomes. He was so skilled at it that he'd convinced himself he was invincible. Tonight, surrounded by cameras and family and the news crew he'd personally invited, he felt completely secure. He believed everyone would follow the script he'd written. He believed Emily would smile on command. He believed I would play the reformed daughter grateful for his forgiveness. He believed his performance would be so compelling that no one would see the puppet master behind the curtain. But I wasn't going to fight him. I was simply going to stop pretending. Stop smoothing over his rough edges. Stop making excuses for his behavior. Stop playing the role he'd assigned me. The truth was, my only weapon, and it was more powerful than any accusation I could hurl at him. I thought about my mother trapped in that house for over 20 years, slowly being poisoned both literally and psychologically. She'd tried to tell people, but without proof, who would believe her? Harold was so respected, so charming in public. The idea that he was capable of such calculated cruelty seemed impossible to anyone who only saw his public face. But now there were cameras, now there was documentation. Now Harold was going to perform for the world, and the world was going to see him for what he truly was not, because I exposed him, but because he would expose himself the moment things didn't go according to his plan. My goal wasn't revenge anymore. It was protection. Protection for Emily, who was living the nightmare my mother had endured. Protection for the baby Emily carried, who would grow up under Harold's control if someone didn't intervene. Protection for any other woman Harold might trap in the future if he was allowed to continue his pattern. I moved to Emily's side again. She was standing where Harold had positioned her, her posture rigid with tension, her hands trembling slightly. The cameras weren't rolling yet, but she was already performing, already terrified of making a mistake. I took her hand and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Whatever happens tonight, I will make sure he can't hurt you anymore. You're not alone. I'm standing with you, not against you. We're going to get through this together." Emily turned to look at me, and I saw hope flickering in her eyes, fragile but growing stronger. "What if He's going to be exactly who he is," I said calmly. "And that's all we need. You don't have to do anything except stop protecting him. Stop covering for him. Stop pretending everything is fine when it's not. Just be honest. The cameras will see the rest." "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know. My mother was scared too. But you're stronger than you think, Emily. And this time you're not facing him alone." I saw the moment something shifted in her. The fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. Determination, maybe. Or just exhaustion with pretending. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply stop lying. Harold called for everyone's attention. "We're about to begin filming. I want everyone to remember this is a joyous occasion. Family coming together, healing old wounds, beautiful sentiments about forgiveness and moving forward. Rebecca, are you ready?" Rebecca Shaw. The reporter nodded. Her camera operator checked his equipment one final time. The room fell into an expectant silence. My plan, if you could even call it a plan, was remarkably simple. I would support Emily. I would remain calm no matter what Harold said or did. I would refuse to perform anger or gratitude or any emotion he expected from me. I would simply exist as myself, honest and unperformative, and see what happened when Harold encountered that honesty. I wouldn't attack him. I wouldn't make accusations. I would just stop enabling his performance. Stop playing my role in his narrative. Stop allowing him to control how I responded to his provocations. Because Harold's power had always come from his ability to make people react. He would criticize and we would defend ourselves. He would provoke, and we would respond with emotion he could then paint as hysteria or unreasonableness. He would create chaos and then position himself as the calm, rational one dealing with difficult women. But what would happen if I didn't react? If I just stood there quiet and honest, letting his behavior speak for itself? My mother used to say that the truth has its own power, its own weight. She'd been too afraid and too trapped to let that truth emerge while she was alive. But I wasn't trapped. And I wasn't afraid anymore. Sometimes the best way to defeat a tyrant isn't to fight them on their terms. It's to stop playing their game entirely and let everyone see what happens when the tyrant no longer has willing participants in their theater of cruelty. Harold adjusted his jacket one final time and turned to the room with his widest smile. Before we begin the formal interview segment, let's get a toast on camera. A beautiful moment of family unity. Everyone please get your glasses. He gestured to the dining room where wine glasses still sat on the table. We'll all raise them together, a perfect shot for the opening of the piece. My relatives obediently retrieved their glasses. Harold had a fresh glass of wine poured for himself. Emily held hers with shaking hands. Harold moved to the center of the room, positioning himself where all cameras could capture him clearly. He raised his glass with the practiced ease of a man who'd made hundreds of toasts at political fundraisers and business dinners. "Let's all raise our glasses for the cameras," he announced, his voice booming with false warmth. "Together as a family." But his eyes, when they met mine, were cold. This was a test, a challenge. He was waiting to see if I would comply, if I would give him the image of unity he needed. I picked up my glass, and I waited. The red recording light flicked on. The camera operator gave a thumbs up. And just like that, we were performing. Harold lifted his glass higher, his smile radiating practiced warmth. "To family," he announced, his voice carrying the slight tremor of manufactured emotion. "To healing forgiveness and new beginnings. To my beautiful wife Emily, who works so hard to make our house a home. And to my daughter Diana, who has finally come back to where she belongs." I watched Emily try to hold her glass steady. Her hand was shaking so badly that the wine trembled, catching the light in small waves. She attempted the smile Harold had demanded, but it looked like something carved into her face with a dull knife, painful and wrong. Her other hand was pressed against her stomach in an unconscious protective gesture, and I could see the bandage on her palm already showing a dark spot where blood was seeping through. She was 3 months pregnant. She'd been cooking for hours under Harold's threatening supervision. She'd cut herself badly enough to need stitches and been forced to continue working. She was exhausted, terrified, and now standing under bright filming lights with cameras documenting every micro-expression, while her husband's hand rested on her shoulder with just enough pressure to remind her what would happen if she failed to perform correctly. I recognized that exact expression on her face. I'd seen it on my mother in 1,000 photographs from my childhood. The smile that didn't reach the eyes, the posture that said, "Please let this be over soon." The barely contained terror of someone walking a tightrope while pretending to stroll casually. Harold positioned himself slightly in front of Emily, dominating the frame the way he always dominated spaces. His body language was proprietorial. "This is my wife, my daughter, my narrative, my moment." He laughed at something Aunt Marie said, but I could see the calculation behind it. Every gesture was measured, designed for the cameras. We moved back to the dining room for the family dinner portion of the filming. Harold directed where everyone should sit, adjusting positions to ensure the best camera angles. He placed Emily directly beside him, close enough to reach her under the table where the cameras couldn't see. As we took our seats, I saw Harold's hand move beneath the tablecloth. Emily flinched almost imperceptibly, and her smile became even more strained. He was gripping her hand, I realized, the injured one, squeezing it hard enough to reopen the cut, hard enough to cause pain, his face all the while showing nothing but benevolent joy as he told an amusing anecdote for the cameras. I noticed other things too, the kind of details you only see when you're looking for them. The way Harold's laughter had a forced, brittle quality to it, like glass about to shatter. The tightness around his eyes that no amount of practiced smiling could hide. The way he constantly adjusted his position to make sure he was the visual center of every shot, subtly shifting his chair forward, angling his body to eclipse Emily when she was getting too much camera time. He leaned toward Emily, his mouth close to her ear, his expression to anyone watching appearing tender and attentive. But I saw Emily's face go pale. I saw her swallow hard. Whatever he'd whispered, and I could guess the content, if not the exact words, it was a threat. Probably a reminder of what he'd do if she didn't maintain the performance. Probably a warning about her father's career. Possibly something about the baby. The camera kept rolling. My relatives made polite conversation. And Harold performed the role of his life-devoted husband, reconciling father-reformed man seeking a second chance. But Rebecca Shaw, the reporter, was watching with an intensity that went beyond professional interest. I noticed her gesture to her camera operator, a small signal that redirected his lens. They weren't just filming the staged moments Harold wanted. They were capturing the reality underneath Emily's trembling hands, Harold's controlling positioning, the fear in Emily's eyes when Harold touched her. During a moment when Harold was turned away speaking to Aunt Marie about his plans for the future, Rebecca moved closer to where I stood. She kept her voice barely above a whisper. Her words meant only for me. "Your mother was my best friend." I turned to look at her, my heart suddenly pounding. Rebecca's eyes held mine. "Catherine and I met at a book club 25 years ago. She told me things over the years, not everything she was too afraid of Harold finding out, but enough. About the control, the psychological abuse, the way he isolated her. Near the end, she was convinced he was poisoning her, but she had no proof and knew no one would believe her. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would watch Harold. Wait for him to show his true nature again." My throat was too tight to speak. "I've been waiting 10 years for this," Rebecca continued, her professional demeanor cracking slightly to show genuine emotion underneath. "When Harold reached out about doing a story on his family reconciliation, I knew this was the moment. I've been documenting men like him for 2 decades, abusers who hide behind charm and public image. Your mother couldn't speak the truth while she was alive, but tonight with these cameras, we're going to show everyone who he really is." She squeezed my arm briefly. "Catherine would be so proud of you. She talked about you constantly, about how strong you were, how you'd escaped when she couldn't. She always said you were her greatest accomplishment, not because of anything you achieved, but because you survived him and built a life free of his control." I felt tears threatening, but forced them back. This wasn't coincidence. My mother had planted seeds before she died. She'd confided in Rebecca, had told her just enough to make her watch, to make her wait, to make her ready for a moment like this. It felt like my mother was here orchestrating this exposure from beyond death, making sure Harold would finally face consequences for what he'd done to her. Harold turned back to the table, his smile sharp and satisfied. He surveyed the scene cameras rolling, family gathered, everyone positioned exactly as he wanted. He looked at me and something predatory flickered in his eyes. "Now," he announced with that same cold smile, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "let's have dinner. Let's see if my daughter finally learned something about hospitality and grace." The trap was set. His trap, he thought. But really, he'd walked into one he couldn't see. All that was left now was for him to be himself. The food was brought out from the kitchen on serving platters, and the change in atmosphere was immediate. Several of my relatives leaned back slightly in their chairs as if putting distance between themselves and what had been placed before them. The main dish looked wrong in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. The chicken had an odd grayish tint in places. The vegetables were cut in jagged, uneven pieces, and there was a smell underneath the herbs and seasonings, something metallic and faintly unpleasant that made my stomach turn. Aunt Marie's smile became fixed. Cousin Jennifer stared at her plate with barely concealed concern. One of the younger relatives actually wrinkled his nose before catching himself and trying to look politely neutral. The cameras captured all of it. Every uncomfortable glance. Every hesitant reach for a fork. Every subtle sign that something was deeply wrong with this meal. Harold's expression was priceless. For just a moment before he remembered he was being filmed, genuine shock crossed his face. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd planned every detail of this evening, orchestrated every element, and the food was meant to be the backdrop for his triumph, not the centerpiece of disaster. But he recovered quickly, smoothing his features into something more controlled. He was still on camera. He could still salvage this. He could still turn this into his moment. He took a deliberate bite, chewing slowly while everyone watched. I could see him processing the taste or lack thereof, the strange texture, the wrongness of it. His jaw worked mechanically, and when he finally swallowed, it looked like an act of will. Then he set down his fork with exaggerated care and pushed his plate away. "Well," he said, his voice carrying across the silent dining room, pitched perfectly for the cameras. "This is certainly interesting." And he let the pause hang there, giving everyone time to understand that interesting meant something else entirely. "Diana, darling." He turned to me with an expression of such condescending disappointment that I'm sure he'd practiced it in the mirror. "I know you haven't cooked much since you moved away from home. I know I spoiled you growing up, never making you help your mother in the kitchen the way I should have, but even a child could do better than this." The insult was delivered with a smile wrapped in false understanding, designed to make him look patient and me look incompetent. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. No one touched their food. "I mean, really," Harold continued, warming to his performance, now playing to the cameras. "Look at this presentation. The vegetables are butchered quite literally, it seems. The seasoning is either absent or overwhelming, I can't tell which. And the smell," he waved his hand dismissively. "I don't even know what that is." He was enjoying this. I could see it in the way his posture relaxed in the slight curl of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. This was what he'd been waiting for, an opportunity to humiliate me publicly, to position himself as the long-suffering father dealing with a disappointing daughter, to show the cameras how gracious and forgiving he could be, even in the face of such failure. "I've tried for years to teach you basic life skills," he said, his tone dripping with false regret. "Your mother tried. God rest her soul, she tried so hard to show you how to be a proper hostess, how to cook a decent meal, how to manage a household. But some people just never learn, I suppose. Some people are too proud to accept help, too stubborn to admit they don't know what they're doing." His voice rose slightly, taking on an edge. "You invite me here after years of silence, you claim you want to reconcile, and then you serve this disaster. Is this what you think of family, Diana? Is this the effort you make when you're supposedly trying to heal old wounds?" The attack was methodical, calculated to paint me as ungrateful, incompetent, and insincere. He was building a narrative where he was the victim of my failings, where every criticism he'd ever leveled at me was justified by this moment. I sat perfectly still through all of it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I didn't show anger or hurt or embarrassment. I simply listened, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my expression neutral. And this, I could see, was driving him insane. He'd expected me to react, to make excuses, to apologize profusely, to give him the emotional response he could then characterize as hysterical or defensive. He'd expected me to play my assigned role in his drama, but I gave him nothing. Just calm, just silence, just truth waiting to emerge. "Well?" he demanded, his voice sharper now, the veneer of patience cracking. "Don't you have anything to say for yourself? No explanation. No apology." His face was reddening. The cameras were still rolling, capturing his increasing agitation, the way his performance was slipping as he confronted my refusal to react according to his script. "I raised you better than this," he said, his voice rising another notch. "Your mother and I sacrificed so much for you, gave you every advantage, and this is how you repay that, with contempt disguised as reconciliation, with a meal that looks like it came from a garbage disposal." Emily was crying silently at the other end of the table. Rebecca's pen was moving rapidly across her notepad. My relatives stared at their plates, trapped between family loyalty and the uncomfortable recognition that something toxic was unfolding before them. Harold was losing control now, his carefully constructed image crumbling with every passing second of my silence. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine with barely contained fury. "Do you have nothing to say?" I picked up my water glass, took a slow, measured sip, and set it back down with deliberate care. Then I looked at him directly, my voice calm and clear in the terrible silence of that room. "I didn't cook tonight, Dad." The words hung in the air like a detonation waiting to happen. For 3 long seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The entire room had become a frozen tableau, everyone processing what I'd just said and what it meant. Harold's face was the most fascinating to watch. It went through a rapid succession of expressions, each one lasting only a fraction of a second before being replaced by the next. First came confusion, genuine bewilderment, as his brain tried to reconcile my statement with his carefully constructed plan. Then came the moment of realization when he understood what I'd just revealed and what was about to happen. And finally came fury raw and undisguised, the mask slipping completely for just an instant before he tried desperately to pull it back into place. But it was too late. The cameras had caught it all. That moment of pure, venomous rage before he remembered he was being filmed. My relatives were statues. Cousin Jennifer had her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, a piece of chicken speared on the tines. Aunt Marie's hand was frozen on her water glass. Even the younger children who'd been fidgeting throughout the meal had gone completely still with the instinctive awareness children have when adults are behaving strangely. And then from the hallway where she'd been standing just out of camera range, Emily stepped forward. She still wore the stained apron from cooking the white fabric, now a canvas of culinary disaster flour sauce, what looked like wine and darker stains that I knew were blood. Her hair had given up any pretense of the elegant updo Harold had arranged before we arrived, hanging in limp strands around her face. The mascara she'd tried to fix earlier had run again, creating dark tracks down her pale cheeks. The bandage on her left hand was soaked through now, dark red spreading through the white gauze. But it was her expression that told the real story. She looked terrified, yes, her whole body was shaking, her breathing rapid and shallow. But underneath the fear was something else. Relief. The kind of relief that comes when you've been holding a terrible secret for so long that releasing it, even knowing the consequences, feels like freedom. Harold moved immediately, his chair scraping back as he stood and positioned himself between Emily and the cameras. His movements were sharp, aggressive, barely controlled. "Emily, darling, you should go rest." His voice was tight, strained, the warm tone he'd been using for the cameras completely gone. "You're not feeling well. Let me handle this." But Emily didn't move. She stood there in the dining room entrance, swaying slightly, staring at the ruined meal on the table. At the faces of my relatives. At me. At the cameras still rolling, still documenting everything. "Emily." Aunt Marie's voice was gentle, concerned. She'd always been the family member most attuned to other people's distress. "Dear, are you all right? Did you cook this dinner?" It was a simple question asked with genuine kindness. But the answer would unravel everything Harold had constructed. Emily's mouth opened. No sound came out at first. I could see her struggling, years of conditioning warring with the desperate need to finally tell someone the truth. Her hands twisted together, the injured one leaving small red smears on the apron. She started, then stopped, tried again. "I tried to." "She's been helping me learn to cook," Harold interjected quickly, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative. "It's a hobby she's taken up. I've been encouraging her, but she's still learning clearly, and tonight she wanted to surprise everyone by preparing the meal herself as practice. I had no idea she was planning this, or I would have—" "Stop lying." Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of that room it carried. Harold's face went from red to pale. "Emily, you're tired and emotional. The pregnancy hormones—" "Stop." She said it louder this time, and I saw several relatives exchange shocked glances. No one interrupted Harold. No one contradicted him. Those were unspoken rules everyone had learned over the years. But Emily was done following rules. She looked around the room, and I could see her taking in the scene, the family members she barely knew, watching her with growing concern and confusion. The news crew with their cameras and lights documenting every moment. Harold positioned between her and everyone else, still trying to control the situation through sheer force of will. And then her eyes found mine. I gave her the smallest nod, the slightest encouragement. "You're not alone. I'm here. Tell them." I cooked tonight, Emily said, her voice gaining strength. Not Diana, me. I made this meal. Well, yes, as I was saying, she's been learning. Harold tried again. I don't know how to cook. The words came faster now, tumbling out as if a dam had broken. I've never known how to cook. All those posts on social media, all those videos of me making elaborate meals, they weren't real. Harold hired professional chefs to make the food, and then I stood there pretending I'd made it. Hours of filming to get 30 seconds of footage where I looked natural enough. I've been living a complete lie. The room erupted in whispers. Relatives looked at each other with dawning understanding. Someone's phone was probably already pulling up Harold's social media, scrolling through the hundreds of posts celebrating Emily as the perfect domestic goddess. She's confused, Harold said loudly, trying to talk over the growing murmur of voices. Pregnancy can do strange things to... I'm 3 months pregnant, Emily continued. And now she was looking directly at the camera, speaking to it as if confessing to a priest. I've been sick every single day, throwing up every morning, and today, Harold made me cook this dinner because he needed footage of me being a devoted wife. When I begged him to let us hire someone, he refused. He said it wouldn't look authentic. Harold grabbed her arm, but Emily jerked away from him with a strength I hadn't known she possessed. That small act of physical resistance seemed to shock him more than anything else. I've never actually seen Emily cook, Jennifer said slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle. In 2 years, not once. I just assumed she cooked when we weren't around because of all those posts. Other relatives were nodding, the realization spreading through the room. The perfect image Harold had constructed was crumbling, and they were all watching it happen in real time. The cameras were capturing every moment, Harold's desperate attempts at control, Emily's trembling defiance, the dawning understanding on everyone's faces. Harold's shirt was soaked with sweat now. His carefully styled hair had become disheveled. The polished politician facade had fractured, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. Emily took a shaking breath, tears streaming down her face, and looked directly at me. In her eyes, I saw gratitude, terror, and determination all mixed together. He forced me, she said. Emily's voice was shaking, but something had fundamentally shifted in her. The words that had been trapped inside for 2 years were finally finding their way out, and once they started flowing, they couldn't be stopped. Harold has never loved me, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. He married me to get access to my father, Senator Richard Chen. Every cooking video you've seen on social media, every post about me being the perfect young wife, every smiling photograph, all of it was scripted, controlled, forced. Harold opened his mouth to interrupt, but Emily kept talking, the dam fully broken now. He makes me film cooking content dozens of times, 30-40 takes for a single 30-second video because my smile isn't genuine enough or my voice sounds uncertain. He stands behind the camera, directing every word, every gesture, every expression. I don't know how to cook. I've never known how to cook. Everything you've seen has been a performance, and I've been living a complete lie for 2 years because he needed the image of a devoted young wife to rebuild his reputation after it collapsed. The relatives were completely still processing this revelation. Several had phones out now, undoubtedly pulling up the social media accounts in question, seeing the posts with new eyes, the too perfect staging, the slightly stiff quality to Emily's smiles that they'd attributed to camera shyness, but now understood as fear. Emily, sweetheart, you're not yourself right now. Harold tried, his voice strained as he attempted to inject some warmth into it. The pregnancy has been difficult for you, and I know you're tired. Don't! Emily said sharply. Don't you dare use my pregnancy as an excuse. She turned to face the room, fully addressing everyone, the relatives, the news crew, the cameras still rolling. Tonight, while I was making this dinner, I cut my hand. She held up her left hand, the bandage now completely soaked through with blood. Harold was standing directly behind me in the kitchen, criticizing every single motion I made, every cut of the vegetables, every seasoning choice. Every second was too slow, every piece was wrong. My hands were shaking so badly because I was terrified of making a mistake, and the knife slipped. With trembling fingers, she began unwrapping the blood-soaked bandage. Several people gasped as the cut was revealed a deep gash across her palm, at least 2 inches long, still bleeding sluggishly. It clearly needed stitches. It should have been treated hours ago. "My blood got into the food," Emily continued, her voice breaking. "Into the vegetables, onto the cutting board, into the marinade. That's why it looks and smells the way it does. That metallic smell you're noticing, that's my blood. The discoloration, my blood. This meal is literally contaminated with my blood because I was forced to keep cooking while injured." Aunt Marie had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Jennifer looked like she might be sick. Even the younger relatives, who'd been largely confused by the adult drama unfolding, understood that something terrible was being revealed. "I showed Harold the cut," Emily said. "I showed him the blood. I begged him to let me stop, to let us order food or start over or do anything except serve contaminated food to his family. And do you know what he said?" The room waited, everyone holding their breath. "He said, 'I cannot disappoint the reporters. You will finish cooking.' He gave me this bandage." She held up the pathetic blood-soaked gauze and told me to wrap it tight and keep going. "When I said the food wasn't safe to eat, he told me that if the dinner was bad, he would tell everyone Diana cooked it. That he'd blame her, make her the scapegoat for my incompetence because his perfect evening couldn't be ruined by something as trivial as his pregnant wife bleeding into the food." Harold's face had gone from pale to deep red, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple. "That's not your twisting what happened. I was trying to be supportive of your efforts to learn." "You threatened me," Emily said, her voice steady now, despite the tears streaming down her face. "You told me that if I revealed the truth about my injury to anyone, you'd tell them I was being dramatic and seeking attention, that I was trying to ruin your evening on purpose. You had the whole story planned out. Either I'd take the blame for bad food or Diana would, but either way you'd emerge as the victim of difficult women who couldn't handle a simple dinner party." The camera operator had moved closer, capturing every word, every tear, every tremor in Emily's voice. Rebecca Shaw was writing frantically, her expression a mixture of professional focus and personal vindication. Harold lunged toward Emily, grabbing for her arm with barely controlled aggression. "That's enough! You're hysterical! We're leaving!" But Emily jerked away from him, stumbling backward. The flinch was visceral, instinctive, the reaction of someone who'd learned to fear touch. And it was captured in perfect high definition by 3 different cameras. The physical recoil said more than words ever could. This wasn't a loving husband reaching for his distressed wife. This was a frightened woman pulling away from someone who'd hurt her. "Don't touch me," Emily said, her voice shaking but firm. Harold froze, seeming to realize for the first time that his control had completely slipped away. His face was now a mottled purple sweat beading on his forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Every molecule of his body language screamed, barely contained violence. Rebecca looked up from her notes, her voice calm but sharp. "Mr. Flores, your wife, is saying she was forced to cook while bleeding, that you threatened her, and that you've been controlling and scripting her entire public persona for 2 years. She's also saying you married her specifically to access her father's political connections. These are serious allegations." "She's being dramatic," Harold spat, all pretense of warmth gone now. "She's pregnant and emotional and doesn't understand how the real world works. I've given her everything, a beautiful home, financial security, social status, and this is how she repays me, with accusations and hysteria." "I'm 3 months pregnant," Emily said, her hand moving protectively to her stomach. "I've been throwing up every morning. I'm exhausted. I'm in pain. And my husband forced me to cook for hours today, made me continue cooking even after I injured myself badly enough to need medical attention, all because he needed perfect footage for his political comeback." One of the other reporters, a younger woman I hadn't noticed before, spoke up from near the back of the room. "Mr. Flores, is this how you treat your wife?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct and impossible to deflect. Harold's mouth opened and closed. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally, looking for someone who would back up his version of events. but everyone was staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to dawning understanding. His perfect evening had become a complete disaster, and it was all being captured on camera. Harold's control shattered like glass. The mask he'd worn so carefully for decades, the charming facade he'd maintained, even through the stress of Emily's revelations, finally cracked completely. "You're useless," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of my dining room. "Absolutely useless. I gave you everything. A beautiful home, financial security status, my name connections your father's money couldn't buy, and you can't even manage one simple dinner without turning it into a circus." The transformation was stunning. The warm, patient tone was gone. The practiced smile had twisted into a snarl. His entire body language changed from open and welcoming to aggressive and threatening. He advanced on Emily, finger pointing like a weapon. "Do you have any idea what you've cost me tonight? What you've destroyed? I had everything planned perfectly. The cameras, the story, the redemption narrative. And you ruined it because you're too incompetent to follow simple instructions, too weak to handle basic tasks, too stupid to understand that sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the greater good." Emily backed away from him until she hit the wall. Several of my relatives stood up abruptly, their chairs scraping. Cousin Jennifer moved protectively toward Emily. Aunt Marie's husband, usually quiet and unobtrusive, positioned himself between Harold and the women. "Harold, that's enough," Uncle Tom said firmly. "Don't tell me what's enough." Harold whirled on him, spittle flying. "You have no idea what I've been dealing with. This ungrateful child," he gestured wildly at Emily, "has had every advantage, every privilege, and she can't even perform the most basic wifely duties without falling apart. I'm leaving." Aunt Marie's voice was quiet, but definite. She stood gathering her purse with shaking hands. "I won't stay and watch this. Whatever this is, it's not family. It's abuse." The word hung in the air. Abuse. Simple, direct, undeniable. "Oh, please," Harold sneered. "Everyone's so sensitive these days. I expect my wife to fulfill basic responsibilities, and suddenly I'm abusive. She's being dramatic, seeking attention, trying to make herself the victim when she's the one who failed." "Harold," my voice cut through his rant, "the cameras are still recording." He froze. His head whipped around to look at the news crew, at the 3 cameras all pointed directly at him, at the red recording lights still glowing. The color drained from his face as he realized what he'd just done, what he'd said, how he'd said it, who had witnessed it. But it was too late. The damage was complete. The reporters had exactly what they needed, Harold's true nature revealed in his own words with no ambiguity or room for interpretation. Not allegations from bitter ex-wives or estranged daughters, but his own voice, his own rage, his own admission of what he really thought of the woman he'd married. Rebecca Shaw's expression was professionally neutral, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. This was the story she'd been waiting a decade to tell. My mother's truth finally vindicated. More relatives were standing now, moving toward the exit with murmured excuses. The social rejection was immediate and total. Harold had spent months planning this gathering to rebuild his reputation, and instead he'd destroyed whatever remained of it in a matter of minutes. Emily stepped away from the wall, and I saw something remarkable happen. She straightened her spine, wiped her tears, and pulled out her phone. "I've been recording you for 6 months, Harold." The room, which had been buzzing with uncomfortable conversation, went silent again. Harold's face went from pale to gray. "What? 6 months ago, I consulted a lawyer using a phone you didn't know about." Emily's voice was steady now, fueled by something beyond fear. "She told me that New York is a one-party consent state. That means I can legally record our conversations without your knowledge or permission, as long as I'm part of the conversation. Everything I've recorded is admissible in court." She tapped her phone screen, and Harold's voice filled the room, his real voice, the one he used when cameras weren't present, when he thought no one was documenting his cruelty. "You're just a tool, Emily. A pretty useless tool. Do you understand that I didn't marry you because I loved you? I married you because your father is Senator Richard Chen, and his connections can resurrect my career. You are a means to an end. Nothing more." Emily's voice on the recording small and broken. "But you said, I said what you needed to hear to get you to the altar, and now you're trapped. If you ever try to leave me, if you ever tell your father what this marriage really is, I will release documents proving he accepted bribes. They're fake, but they're good fakes, good enough to destroy him. So you'll stay. You'll smile. You'll play your role. And you'll do it willingly, because the alternative is watching your father's career burn." Emily stopped the playback. The silence in the room was absolute. "I have hours of recordings," she said quietly. "Hours of threats. Hours of him telling me exactly how to perform for social media. Hours of him instructing me on what to say to my father to extract information or influence votes. Hours of evidence that this marriage was never about love. It was always about leverage." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of relatives who'd attended her wedding, who'd smiled at social media posts, who'd believed in the fairy tale of the reformed widower finding love again with a young devoted wife. "I can't protect him anymore," Emily whispered. "I won't." Emily wasn't finished. Now that she'd started speaking the truth, it seemed like she couldn't stop. The words poured out of her with the force of a confession that had been held back too long. "Harold didn't marry me because he fell in love with a younger woman," she said, addressing the room, but particularly the cameras. "He married me because my father is Senator Richard Chen, and I was his ticket back to relevance." She took a shaky breath, steadying herself before continuing. "2 years ago, my father was leading an investigation into Harold's business dealings. There were allegations of financial fraud investments that cost local families their retirement savings, falsified documents, misrepresentation of assets. Harold was facing serious charges, criminal charges, the kind that would have meant prison time, not just fines. His reputation was already in ruins. His business partners had distanced themselves. He was essentially radioactive in political and financial circles." I watched Harold's face as Emily spoke. He'd gone very still, his earlier rage replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his reach. "I met Harold at a fundraiser for my father's re-election campaign," Emily continued. "I was working for the campaign at the time, coordinating volunteer efforts. Harold approached me during the reception. He seemed kind, cultured, a little sad. He told me he'd recently lost his wife and was trying to rebuild his life. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, seemed genuinely interested in my ideas about community outreach. Over the next few weeks, he kept showing up at campaign events, at coffee shops near my office, at the gym I attended. He said it was coincidence that we clearly traveled in the same circles." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "It wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. He'd researched me, learned my routines, positioned himself to seem like a natural part of my life. Within a month, he was asking me to dinner. Within 2 months, he was telling me he was falling in love with me. My father opposed the relationship. From the start, he didn't trust Harold, didn't believe his transformation was genuine, thought the timing was too convenient. But I was 26 and thought I knew better. I thought my father was being cynical, unable to see that people could change, that someone could genuinely want to be better." Several relatives were nodding slightly, remembering their own concerns about the hasty marriage concerns they'd kept to themselves out of politeness. "We were married 3 months after we met. It was quick, but Harold said, 'When you know, you know.' He cried during the ceremony. He told my parents they were gaining a son who would cherish their daughter. My mother cried. My father remained skeptical, but he gave us his blessing because I was so clearly happy." Emily's voice cracked. "Or what I thought was happiness, what was actually the relief of thinking I'd found someone who loved me." She pulled out her phone again, pulling up documents. 6 months after our wedding, the investigation into Harold's finances was quietly dropped. My father received pressure from colleagues, political favors were called, and donors made phone calls. Influential people suggested it would be better to let the matter rest. My father thought Harold had genuinely reformed, that the investigation had been overblown, that as his son-in-law Harold deserved the benefit of the doubt. But that wasn't what happened. What happened was, Harold used his marriage to me to access my father's political network, to call in favors, to trade on relationships that had taken my father 30 years to build. Harold finally found his voice. That's a gross misrepresentation of, I found the documents 6 months ago. Emily talked over him, her voice rising. Harold had gotten careless, left his home office unlocked when he usually kept it sealed. I found a folder labeled Insurance that contained fabricated evidence of financial misconduct involving my father. Fake receipts showing my father accepting cash payments from developers. Doctored emails suggesting quid pro quo arrangements. Falsified bank statements. All of it completely fake but professionally done. Convincing enough to destroy someone's career if released to the media. The horror on my relatives' faces was genuine. This had gone beyond toxic marriage dynamics into criminal territory, blackmail, fraud, conspiracy. When I confronted Harold about the documents, he didn't even try to deny it. He just looked at me and said, "That's your insurance policy and mine. If you ever try to leave me, if you ever tell your father what this marriage really is, I release these documents. Your father will be investigated. His career will be destroyed. He might even face criminal charges. And everyone will believe he's corrupt because the evidence will be that convincing." Then he smiled and said, "So you'll stay, and you'll smile, and you'll play the perfect wife, because the alternative is watching your father lose everything." Emily was openly crying now, but her voice remained steady. "I've been trapped for 6 months living in terror. Every time I saw my father, I wanted to warn him, to tell him the truth, but I couldn't risk it. Harold monitors my phone, reads my messages, controls who I see and when I see them. He isolated me from my family by suggesting they didn't understand our relationship, that they were trying to control me. He positioned himself as my only real support while simultaneously threatening to destroy the person I love most in the world." Rebecca Shaw was writing furiously, her expression a mixture of professional focus and barely concealed outrage. This wasn't just a story about a difficult marriage anymore. This was criminal conspiracy, political manipulation, and blackmail. This was a major scandal. "I was never a wife to Harold," Emily said, looking directly at the cameras now. "I was a business transaction, a strategic acquisition, a means of accessing political power and protection. He married me for leverage, and he's kept me trapped through threats. Every social media post, every public appearance, every smile has been performed under duress. The perfect marriage everyone saw was a carefully constructed fraud designed to rehabilitate Harold's reputation, while simultaneously giving him access to my father's political network." The room was utterly silent, except for Emily's voice and the quiet whir of the cameras. Even the younger relatives had stopped fidgeting, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, something that would be discussed and remembered for years. Harold stood perfectly still for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to track. Then, like a cornered animal, he lashed out in the only direction he could. He turned on me, his arm shooting out to point accusingly, his voice rising to a shout that made several people flinch. "This is your doing," he roared. "You poisoned her against me. You've always been a poison in this family, Diana. You turned your mother against me. You've spent years spreading lies, and now you've manipulated Emily into believing your twisted narrative. This is all part of your vendetta because you can't accept that I was a good father and you were an ungrateful daughter." The accusation was so absurd, so completely disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. But I didn't. I just stood there, calm and quiet, letting him rage, letting the cameras capture every word of his desperate attempt to reframe the narrative one more time, because Harold still believed he could control the story. He still thought if he shouted loud enough, blamed someone else thoroughly enough, performed outrage convincingly enough, he could make people doubt what they'd just witnessed. But he was wrong. And he was about to find out just how wrong. Harold's finger was still pointed at me, trembling with rage, his whole body vibrating with barely contained fury. His face had gone from pale to a mottled red veins standing out on his forehead and neck. He looked like a man on the edge of a complete breakdown. "Everything that's gone wrong in my life traces back to you." His voice was raw, stripped of any pretense of control. "You were the ungrateful daughter who refused to appreciate everything I provided. You turned your back on this family the moment your mother died, abandoned me when I needed you most. You spread lies about me to anyone who would listen, poisoned family members against me, destroyed my business relationships with your accusations." He took a step toward me, and Uncle Tom moved to intercept him, but I held up a hand. I wasn't afraid of Harold anymore. I hadn't been afraid of him for 15 years. "You drove your mother to an early grave." Harold's voice cracked on the words. "Your defiance, your constant rebellion, your refusal to be the daughter she deserved, it killed her. The stress of dealing with you, of trying to manage your impossible behavior, it wore her down until there was nothing left. And then you left. You abandoned her when she needed you, and within a year she was dead. That's on you, Diana. Her death is on you." The accusation hung in the air, and I saw several relatives shift uncomfortably. They didn't believe him, how could they, after what they'd just witnessed? But the claim was so monstrous, so extreme, that it demanded a response. I stood slowly, deliberately. The room fell silent. Even Harold stopped his ranting, perhaps sensing that something significant was about to happen. When I spoke, my voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of the emotion Harold had been trying to provoke. "You taught me fear from the time I was a child," I said. "Every dinner was a minefield. Every conversation was a test I could fail at any moment. Every achievement was something you found a way to diminish. You systematically destroyed my mother's confidence and sense of self over 20 years of marriage, breaking her down piece by piece until she was a shadow of the woman she'd been when she married you." Harold opened his mouth to interrupt, but I continued, my voice cutting through his attempt. "And now you're doing the exact same thing to Emily. The same patterns, the same tactics, the same systematic dismantling of another woman's autonomy and self-worth. This isn't about me poisoning anyone against you. This is about you following the same pattern of abuse you've used for decades. The only difference is that this time there are witnesses, there are cameras, there's documentation, and you can't rewrite this story the way you rewrote all the others." My composure seemed to infuriate him more than any accusation could have. He wanted me angry, defensive, emotional, something he could use against me, something he could characterize as hysteria or bitterness. But I gave him nothing except truth delivered calmly and without malice. "You're twisting everything." Harold's voice was hoarse now. "I was a good father. I provided for you, gave you every advantage, tried to teach you how to be a decent human being, and you repaid me with contempt and lies." "Harold." Rebecca Shaw's voice cut through his rant. She'd stood from where she'd been taking notes, her expression no longer neutral and professional, but openly engaged. "Diana mentioned her mother. I think it's time I disclosed something." Harold turned to face her, and I saw confusion replace some of the rage on his face. "I was Catherine's best friend," Rebecca said quietly. "We met at a book club 25 years ago and remained close until her death. She confided in me not everything, she was too afraid of you to tell anyone everything but enough. About the control, the public humiliation, the way you systematically isolated her from friends and family, the mysterious illnesses that only seemed to happen when she was planning to leave you." Harold's face drained of color. "Catherine was mentally unstable. Everyone who knew her understood she was prone to—" "She was not unstable," Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp. "She was terrified. There's a difference. And before she died, she told me she believed you were poisoning her. She had no proof, and she knew no one would believe her, so she never went public with the accusation. But she told me. She told me to watch you, to remember, to wait for you to show your true nature again." The room had gone completely still. The word poisoning hung in the air like a physical presence. "That's insane," Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She was sick. Heart failure. The doctors confirmed—" The doctors confirmed what looked like heart failure, Rebecca said. But they weren't looking for poison because no one suspected it. Tonight, watching how you treat Emily, forcing her to cook while injured and pregnant, threatening her, controlling every aspect of her life, blackmailing her with fabricated evidence against her father, I'm beginning to understand exactly what Catherine was trying to tell me. Rebecca turned to me and I saw recognition in her eyes. She knew I had something. Something my mother had left me. Diana, she said gently, but clearly making sure the cameras caught this moment. Do you have anything you'd like to share about your mother? Any evidence she might have left behind? This was it, the moment I'd been moving toward since I heard my mother's voice on that USB drive. The moment she'd been preparing me for when she recorded those files, knowing she wouldn't live to see Harold face consequences, but hoping I would be strong enough to make sure he eventually did. I pulled out my phone, my hand steady despite my racing heart. I connected it to the portable speaker I'd set up earlier for background music, a speaker that was now going to serve a very different purpose. I looked at Harold, at his face cycling through emotions: confusion, fear, calculation, rage. I looked at Emily, who was watching me with something like hope in her eyes. I looked at the cameras, still recording, still documenting everything, and I said, my voice clear and firm, "You want the truth. Here it is." I tapped the screen, and my mother's voice filled the dining room. The effect was immediate and profound. It was one thing to hear accusations from living people, from Emily and me, people Harold could dismiss as vindictive or unstable. It was something else entirely to hear the voice of a dead woman speaking from beyond the grave, her words carrying the weight of a final testimony. "My name is Catherine Flores." Several relatives gasped. Aunt Marie's hand flew to her mouth. The voice was unmistakably my mother's, weakened by illness, strained by fear, but absolutely her. The recording quality made it clear this wasn't some old home video. This was recent, deliberate, recorded with purpose in the final months or weeks of her life. "I'm recording this because I believe my husband Harold has been poisoning me for years." The room seemed to stop breathing. Even the camera operators went completely still, as if afraid that any movement might break the spell of this moment. Every time I tried to stand up to him, every time I threatened to leave, every time I found the courage to say I wanted a divorce, I would become mysteriously ill within days, sometimes within hours. The doctors have run every test imaginable, and they find nothing conclusive. They say it's stress. They say it's psychosomatic. They say I'm depressed or anxious or simply worn down by life. But I know. I know what I feel. I know the patterns. Small amounts of something in my food and my tea making me weak, making me compliant, making it impossible to think clearly or act decisively or escape with my daughter. I watched Harold as my mother's voice filled the space. His face had gone from red to gray, all color draining away. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish drowning in air. His hands trembled at his sides. My mother's voice continued, growing slightly stronger, as if she were summoning her last reserves of energy to make sure this message was clear. "I believe he's been doing this for at least 10 years. I started noticing the pattern after I threatened divorce when Diana was 6 years old. I'd told Harold I was going to take Diana and leave, that I'd found a lawyer and started the paperwork. That night he made me tea, said it would help me calm down, help me think clearly. I drank it because I didn't suspect, not then, not yet. Within an hour I was dizzy, disoriented, unable to stand without help. Within 3 days I was so weak I couldn't get out of bed. The doctors were baffled. By the time I recovered, weeks had passed, and my lawyer had moved on to other cases, and I'd lost my momentum. Emily was crying silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. Rebecca Shaw had tears streaming down her face, her pen forgotten in her hand. Even Uncle Tom, normally stoic and reserved, looked stricken. It happened again when Diana was 10 and again when she was 14. Every time I gathered the strength to try to leave, every time I made plans or contacted lawyers or told Harold I couldn't live like this anymore, I would become mysteriously ill. And over time I became a shadow of myself, too weak to fight, too foggy to plan, too worn down to do anything except exist in the prison Harold created for me. My mother paused in the recording, and I could hear her labored breathing, the effort it took to keep speaking. Harold isolated me from my friends, from my family, from anyone who might have helped me see what was happening. He controlled every aspect of my life, what I ate when I slept, who I spoke to, where I went. And slowly, methodically, he poisoned both my body and my spirit. I'm dying now. I know I am. The doctors say it's heart failure, but I know better. My heart is failing because it's been slowly poisoned for years. Because Harold has been destroying me from the inside out so slowly that no one would notice, so carefully that there would be no evidence. Harold finally found his voice hoarse and desperate. She was mentally ill. Everyone knew she was unstable toward the end. You can't. Quiet, Aunt Marie said sharply, her voice cutting through his protestations. Let her finish. My mother's voice rose slightly, taking on an urgency that made my chest tighten. If I die young, and I will please investigate. Don't let him get away with this. Don't let him do to another woman what he's done to me. Harold is not a man capable of love. He's a man capable only of control and possession and destruction. And please, please protect Diana from him. She's stronger than I ever was. She has my mother's spine, my mother's fire. Don't let Harold extinguish that light the way he extinguished mine. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. One of my cousins was sobbing openly. Aunt Marie had both hands over her face, her shoulders shaking. Several relatives stood frozen, as if the weight of what they'd just heard had turned them to stone. Dr. Morrison, a family friend who'd come as Uncle Tom's guest, spoke into the silence. His voice was professional, but shaken. Chronic arsenic poisoning presents exactly as Catherine described. Episodic illness following exposure, progressive weakness and mental confusion, symptoms that mimic other conditions, depression, chronic fatigue, heart problems. It's difficult to diagnose unless you're specifically looking for it, because the symptoms can be attributed to so many other causes. And if it's administered in small doses over years, it would be almost impossible to detect unless you knew to test for it. He looked directly at Harold. If someone wanted to slowly kill their spouse while making it look like natural causes, arsenic would be an effective choice. Easily obtainable in pesticides and other common products, difficult to detect, and the long-term effects mimic heart failure, which is exactly what Catherine's death certificate says she died from. Harold's legs seemed to give out. He stumbled backward until he hit the wall, his face a mask of panic and denial. She was paranoid, delusional. You can't take the word of a dying woman who was clearly mentally compromised. She wasn't compromised, Rebecca said, her voice shaking with emotion. She was terrified. She was being systematically murdered, and she knew it, and she was desperate to leave some record of the truth before she died. Catherine was one of the sanest, most grounded people I've ever known. If she said Harold was poisoning her, I believe her. Especially after everything we've witnessed tonight. Rebecca turned to her camera operator, her professional demeanor snapping back into place, despite the tears still wet on her cheeks. Mike, make sure you have all of this recorded. Every word. The audio from Catherine, the testimony from Emily Harold's behavior tonight. All of it. She pulled out her phone. We're sending this footage and evidence directly to the authorities. This isn't just a story anymore. This is a potential murder investigation. Harold made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. You can't prove anything. She's been dead for 10 years. There's no evidence. Just the paranoid delusions of a mentally ill woman and the vindictive accusations of a daughter who hated her father. But his voice lacked conviction. He knew, as everyone in that room knew, that the evidence was mounting. Emily's recordings. My mother's testimony. His own behavior captured on camera tonight. The pattern was too clear, too consistent, too damning to dismiss. Rebecca met my eyes across the room and nodded once. Then she looked directly into the camera. This is Rebecca Shaw reporting from what was supposed to be a heartwarming story about family reconciliation. Instead, We may have just documented evidence of domestic abuse, blackmail fraud, and possible murder. Everything you've seen tonight will be turned over to law enforcement immediately." The dinner party ended with Harold being escorted out by Uncle Tom and 2 other male relatives, who made it clear he wasn't welcome to stay another moment. Emily came home with me that night, sleeping in my guest room. Her phone turned off so Harold couldn't track her location. She'd finally made the break, and there was no going back. I didn't sleep. I sat up watching my phone as the news began to spread. Rebecca's news organization posted the story at 11 p.m. just in time for the late news cycle. The headline was stark and impossible to ignore. "Local political figure accused of abuse, blackmail, and possible murder." Within an hour, it had been picked up by 3 other news outlets. By midnight, it was trending on social media. I watched in real time as the video went viral. The footage of Harold screaming at Emily, calling her useless, his face contorted with rage. The audio of my mother's weak voice accusing him of poisoning her. Emily's testimony about the blackmail and forced performances. The contrast between Harold's carefully curated social media presence, hundreds of posts showing the devoted husband with his perfect young wife, and the reality captured on camera was so jarring that people couldn't look away. The hashtag started around 2 a.m. Hashtag Christmas Tyrant was first referencing the holiday dinner that had exposed him. Then #Dinner Bully, focusing on his treatment of Emily and me. By morning, #Justice. For Catherine was trending nationally, with people demanding an investigation into my mother's death. Social media users had started pulling up Harold's old posts, the ones showing Emily smiling over elaborate meals, and posting them side by side with screenshots from the news footage showing her terrified and bleeding. The juxtaposition was damning. "This is what abuse looks like behind closed doors." Read one viral tweet with millions of views. He spent 2 years creating a fake perfect marriage while blackmailing and controlling his wife. The think pieces started before dawn. The performance of perfect families. What Harold Flores teaches us about abusers and social media. When family values are a weapon inside the mind of a controlling husband. The wives we didn't save, remembering Catherine Flores. By 6 a.m., I was watching cable news coverage. Every major network had picked up the story. They were showing the footage, playing the audio, interviewing domestic violence experts who explained coercive control and the patterns of abuse that could lead to murder. Then at 8 a.m., Senator Richard Chen called a press conference. I watched it live on my laptop while Emily slept upstairs. The senator looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His wife stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her expression devastated. "I'm here to address the situation involving my daughter Emily and my son-in-law Harold Flores." He began, his voice steady but strained. "First and foremost, I want to say to Emily, I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. You tried to tell me in small ways that something was wrong. You pulled away from family gatherings. You stopped calling as often. You seemed anxious whenever Harold was nearby. And I attributed it to normal adjustment to marriage, to the age difference, to you building your own life. I should have looked closer. I should have listened better. I should have trusted my initial instincts that something about this marriage wasn't right." He paused, collecting himself. "I was deceived by Harold Flores. He manipulated my daughter and used her to access my political connections and influence. He married her not out of love, but as part of a calculated strategy to rehabilitate his reputation and gain protection from ongoing investigations into his financial misconduct. I had no idea, and this will haunt me for the rest of my life, that my daughter was living in fear, being blackmailed with fabricated evidence against me, being forced to perform a false life for social media while suffering abuse behind closed doors." The senator's voice grew firmer. "I am immediately and permanently cutting all ties with Harold Flores. I am cooperating fully with law enforcement in their investigations. Any political protection or access he gained through his marriage to my daughter is revoked effective immediately. I have instructed my staff to compile any communications or interactions they've had with Mr. Flores that might be relevant to criminal investigations. If he used my name, my position, or my connections to commit crimes or evade justice, I want that exposed and prosecuted. Senator Chen looked directly into the camera. I also want to address the allegations regarding Catherine Flores Harold's first wife. If there is any truth to the claim that she was poisoned, that she was murdered over the course of years, while people looked the other way, then that is a moral failing of everyone who knew them, myself included. I knew Catherine. She was a gentle, intelligent, kind woman. If she was crying out for help, and no one heard her, we all bear some responsibility. I'm calling for a full investigation into her death. The truth needs to come out no matter how painful. He finished by looking off-camera, presumably at Emily, though she wasn't shown in the shot. Emily, you're safe now. You're safe. Come home. We'll protect you. We'll make sure he can never hurt you again. I love you, and I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening sooner. The press conference ended, but the ramifications kept cascading. By noon, 3 separate law enforcement agencies had announced investigations. The district attorney's office was looking into the blackmail allegations and the fabricated evidence against Senator Chen, charges that could include fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The state police had opened a domestic abuse investigation based on Emily's testimony and the recorded evidence. And most seriously, the county prosecutor announced that they were requesting an exhumation order for my mother's body to test for poison, opening a potential homicide investigation. Harold's assets were frozen. His business partners issued statements distancing themselves from him. The few remaining friends he had were refusing to take his calls. His lawyers released a brief statement denying all allegations and calling the accusations a coordinated attack by vindictive family members. But the statement was lost in the deluge of evidence and public outrage. The man who'd spent decades building and protecting his reputation, who'd controlled every narrative and manipulated every situation to maintain his image, had lost everything in the span of 12 hours. The control he'd wielded so effectively had been his entire identity, and now it was gone. On the second day after the dinner, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find 2 detectives in plain clothes, their badges held up for identification. "Diana Flores?" the older one asked. "Yes. I'm Detective Martinez. This is Detective Chen, no relation to the senator," she added with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We need to speak with you about Harold Flores and your mother, Catherine. May we come in?" I led the detectives into my living room, offering them coffee, which they both declined. Detective Martinez settled into the chair across from me, while Detective Chen remained standing, notepad in hand. They both had the weary, focused look of people who'd been working around the clock. "Ms. Flores, we've been building a case against your father for the past 48 hours, Detective Martinez began. "I want you to know that what started as a viral video has become one of the most complex investigations I've handled in 20 years. We're looking at multiple serious charges across several jurisdictions." She pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed case file. "We've received substantial evidence from multiple sources. Rebecca Shaw from Channel 7 provided us with all the raw footage from the dinner, not just what aired, but everything the cameras captured. Hours of Harold's behavior, his treatment of Emily, his reactions when confronted. The footage alone is damning, but it's just the beginning." Detective Chen picked up the narrative. "Emily Chen Flores has been incredibly cooperative. She provided us with 6 months of audio recordings documenting Harold's threats, his control tactics, and his explicit admissions about why he married her. In New York, those recordings are completely legal and admissible. She also gave us email correspondence where Harold threatened to release fabricated evidence against Senator Chen if she left him. Text messages showing how he monitored and controlled her daily activities. Photos of injuries, including the cut on her hand from the dinner preparation. We've also obtained bank records," Detective Martinez continued. "This is where things get particularly interesting. Harold purchased arsenic-based pesticides and rodenticides repeatedly over a 10-year period, roughly from when your mother first threatened divorce until her death. The purchases are documented across multiple stores, always paid in cash, but captured on security cameras and matched to his credit card purchases of other items on the same shopping trips. My breath caught. They had evidence. Real physical evidence beyond just testimony and recordings. The interesting thing is, Detective Chen added, Harold has never had a garden. His property records show no gardening activity. His neighbors have stated in interviews that they never saw him doing yard work or dealing with pest problems. Yet he was buying products containing arsenic on a regular basis for years. When we asked him about this in interrogation, he claimed it was for a garden at a rental property he owned. But that property has been professionally maintained by a landscaping company the entire time he's owned it. Detective Martinez leaned forward. We also have credit card receipts from the time periods when your mother was experiencing her mysterious illnesses. Harold purchased expensive loose-leaf tea from specialty shops multiple times during these periods. Your mother's friends have told us that she wasn't a tea drinker, but Harold would often bring her tea when she was upset or stressed. Said it would help her calm down. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. We brought Harold in for questioning yesterday, Detective Martinez said. I want you to understand what we're dealing with. Even in custody, even facing serious charges, he hasn't shown a single moment of genuine remorse or self-reflection. His entire interrogation was an exercise in blame-shifting and manipulation. She played a clip from her tablet. Harold's voice filled my living room, and I felt a chill despite knowing he was miles away in a holding cell. My late wife was mentally unstable. Everyone who knew Catherine understood she had psychological problems. Diana has resented me since childhood. I could never understand why I gave her everything, and she's manufactured this vendetta to destroy me. Emily is young and impressionable. My daughter clearly manipulated her, took advantage of normal marital difficulties, and turned them into this circus. I'm the victim here. I'm the one who's been betrayed and slandered. Detective Martinez stopped the playback. He went on like that for 3 hours. Not once did he express concern for Emily's well-being. Not once did he acknowledge that his behavior as captured on video was inappropriate. He blamed you. He blamed Emily. He blamed your mother. He blamed the media. Everyone was at fault except him. We had a forensic psychologist review the interrogation, Detective Chen said. She identified classic markers of narcissistic personality disorder and sociopathic traits, complete lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self-belief that rules don't apply to him, and an absolute inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Ironically, his refusal to show any remorse or genuine emotion actually strengthens our case. It demonstrates the pattern of behavior consistent with someone capable of long-term abuse and potentially murder. Detective Martinez looked at me directly. We need you to provide formal testimony. Everything you remember about your childhood, about your mother's mysterious illnesses, about the patterns of abuse you witnessed. I know this is difficult, but your testimony is crucial. Over the next 3 hours, I told them everything. The dinner parties where my mother was publicly humiliated. The way she would shrink and become quieter over the years. The night Harold blamed me for a meal I hadn't cooked, watching my mother accept fault to protect me. The times my mother was suddenly inexplicably ill after confrontations with Harold. The way she pulled away from friends and family, not because she wanted to, but because Harold had systematically isolated her. I told them about my own childhood, about learning to walk on eggshells, about the constant criticism designed to erode confidence. About the patterns I now recognized as deliberate psychological warfare, rather than just a difficult parent. I provided the USB drive watching as they logged it into evidence with careful documentation. I gave them the names of my mother's friends who might remember her talking about her health issues. I described the funeral, how Harold had played the grieving widower perfectly, while I stood there knowing something was deeply wrong but having no way to prove it. Detective Martinez took notes throughout, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finally finished, she sat back and looked at me with something like admiration. Ms. Flores, your testimony is incredibly valuable. You're calm, detailed, specific about dates and events. You're not embellishing or exaggerating. You're clearly not motivated by revenge or spite. You're simply telling the truth as you experienced it. That kind of testimony is powerful in court. Your mother's recording gave us probable cause to investigate, Detective Chen added. Your testimony gives us context and pattern evidence. Emily's recordings give us motive and contemporary abuse. Together, we have a strong case for multiple charges: domestic abuse, coercive control, blackmail fraud, and potentially murder. Detective Martinez's expression became grave. Which brings me to the difficult part. We've obtained a court order to exhume your mother's body. Modern forensic testing can detect arsenic in hair and nail samples for years after death. If your mother was poisoned as she believed, we should be able to prove it. The words hit me with unexpected force. My mother's body, which had been resting for 10 years, was going to be disturbed. But it was necessary. It was the only way to prove what she'd tried so hard to tell people before she died. The exhumation is scheduled for next week, Detective Chen said quietly. We'll handle everything with respect and dignity. And if we find what we expect to find, Harold Flores will be charged with first-degree murder. Detective Martinez stood preparing to leave. Then she paused as if debating whether to say something. There's one more thing, she said finally. Harold has requested to see you. One final meeting before potential charges are filed. You're under no obligation to agree, but he's been insistent, and sometimes these meetings can provide additional evidence or admissions. Would you consider it? I looked at both detectives, at their tired faces and careful professionalism. They'd worked tirelessly to build a case against a man who'd evaded consequences for decades. They were seeking justice for my mother, for Emily, for all the women Harold had hurt. Yes, I said. I'll see him. The call came at 3 a.m, 3 days after Harold's arrest. Detective Martinez's voice was professional, but I could hear the fatigue beneath it. Diana, I need to inform you that Harold attempted suicide in his cell tonight. He's alive. He was found in time and is currently in the hospital under guard. I wanted you to hear it from me before it hits the news. I sat up in bed processing this information with a clarity that surprised me. I felt no panic, no rush of concern or conflicting emotions. Just a cold, crystalline understanding of what this meant. How did he do it? I asked. Pills. We're still investigating how he obtained them, either smuggled in during intake or acquired from another inmate. He was found unconscious during a routine cell check. Another 20 minutes and he wouldn't have made it. There was a pause on the line. The hospital is asking if you want to visit. As his daughter, you're listed as next of kin. No. My answer was immediate and firm. He doesn't get to choose his ending. He doesn't get the easy way out. He has to live with what he's done. That's his real punishment, waking up every day knowing he lost everything, knowing the truth came out, knowing he'll spend the rest of his life caged the way he caged my mother and Emily. I could hear Detective Martinez's small sound of approval. I'll let them know. For what it's worth, I think you're right. Suicide would be mercy, and I don't think Harold Flores deserves mercy. The news of the suicide attempt broke by morning. Social media's reaction was swift and largely unsympathetic. Coward, people wrote. Guilty conscience. If he was innocent, why try to escape justice? The attempt was widely seen as an admission of guilt, another piece of evidence in the court of public opinion that Harold was everything he'd been accused of being. By afternoon, Harold had been moved to a medical unit in the county jail, placed under 24-hour suicide watch. He would be monitored constantly, his cell stripped of anything he could use to harm himself. He would live whether he wanted to or not, and face every consequence of his actions. A week later, Detective Martinez called again. This time her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. The exhumation was completed yesterday. We rushed the forensic toxicology. Diana, your mother was right. About all of it. I closed my eyes, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. The forensic pathologist found elevated levels of arsenic in your mother's preserved hair and nail samples. Hair and nails retain toxins for years after death, which is why we can still detect it even after 10 years. The pattern is conclusive. This wasn't accidental exposure from environmental sources or contaminated water. This was deliberate repeated administration of arsenic over approximately 8 to 10 years. Detective Martinez continued, her voice careful and precise. The levels varied over time, which tells us about the pattern of administration. Lower levels during periods when we can document your mother seemed more compliant or resigned. Higher levels during periods when family and friends report she was talking about divorce or seemed to be gathering strength to leave. The final 2 years of her life showed the highest concentrations. He was increasing the doses as she became more desperate to escape. I felt tears running down my face, but my voice remained steady. What does that mean medically? I'll read you what the forensic pathologist wrote in his report. I heard papers rustling. This wasn't accidental exposure. The pattern indicates deliberate repeated administration of arsenic in doses carefully calculated to debilitate, but not immediately kill. This method represents a particularly cruel form of torture that allowed the perpetrator to maintain control while slowly destroying the victim's health autonomy and will to resist. The victim would have experienced chronic fatigue, mental confusion, digestive problems, and progressive weakness. She would have felt herself deteriorating, but been unable to identify the cause. Medical professionals treating her would have found her symptoms difficult to diagnose without specific testing for poisoning. Catherine Flores was murdered over the course of a decade. The clinical language somehow made it worse. My mother hadn't just died. She'd been murdered slowly, methodically over 10 years of calculated cruelty. He killed her for wanting to leave him, I said, my voice hollow. He poisoned her over and over every time she tried to gather the strength to escape. He literally destroyed her from the inside out rather than let her go. Yes, Detective Martinez said quietly. That's exactly what he did. What happens now? Harold Flores is being charged with first-degree murder in the death of Catherine Flores. Additional charges include attempted fraud for fabricating evidence against Senator Chen blackmail and extortion against Emily Chen Flores coercive control and aggravated domestic violence. If convicted on all charges, he's looking at life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Over the next few days, the forensic evidence became public. The news coverage shifted from scandal to something darker and more serious. This wasn't just a story about a controlling husband anymore. This was a murder case. A woman had spent the final decade of her life being slowly poisoned by the man who'd vowed to love her, and she'd died trying to warn her daughter about the danger. The public response was overwhelming. Advocacy groups for domestic violence survivors rallied around my mother's story. Remember, Catherine trended as people shared stories of women who'd tried to leave abusive situations and weren't believed. Legislators began discussing changes to domestic violence laws, particularly around coercive control and the difficulty of proving non-physical abuse. Harold remained in the medical unit under constant watch. The prison psychologist evaluated him and determined he was competent to stand trial, but remained a significant suicide risk. He would be monitored around the clock for the foreseeable future. 10 days after the forensic results came back, I received another call from the prison. Ms. Flores, this is Correctional Officer Phillips from the county jail. Harold Flores has been requesting to speak with you multiple times a day for the past week. He says he needs to tell you something important. Says it's about your mother. You're under no obligation to visit, but I wanted to relay the message. I'd been expecting this. Harold, stripped of all control, facing life in prison, wanted one last chance to manipulate someone. One last opportunity to rewrite the narrative or plant seeds of doubt. One final performance. I'll come, I said. Schedule it for tomorrow afternoon. The next day I drove to the county jail and went through the security procedures for a visit with a high-risk inmate. They led me to a small visiting room, not the open area with phones and glass partitions, but a private space where serious conversations happened under guard supervision. And then Harold was brought in. He looked like he'd aged 30 years in 2 weeks. His hair, usually so carefully styled, was completely gray and unkempt. His skin had a grayish pallor. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. But it was his eyes that shocked me most. They were hollow, empty, the arrogant confidence I'd seen my entire life completely gone. He sat down across from me, his hands shackled to the table. A guard stood by the door. And for the first time in my life, I saw Harold Flores with absolutely no power at all. We sat in silence for a long moment, studying each other across the scarred metal table. Harold's shackled hands rested on the surface between us, and I noticed they were trembling slightly. Whether from medication withdrawal or simple fear, I couldn't tell. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it much in the past week. "I never loved your mother." The words should have hurt, but they didn't. I'd known this truth for years, even if I'd never heard him say it so baldly. "She came into the marriage already pregnant with you, another man's child. Robert Chen. That was his name, wasn't it? Your mother's first love, the man she actually wanted to marry before her family forced her into accepting me instead." His laugh was bitter and hollow. "I was supposed to just accept it. Raise you as my own. Play the happy husband to a woman who loved someone else. Pretend I didn't know that every time she looked at you, she was remembering him." Harold's eyes met mine, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Not remorse or regret, but a twisted kind of honesty. He had nothing left to lose, no reason to maintain pretenses. "When I found out the truth, you were 3, a hospital blood test that didn't match what it should have, I thought about leaving, filing for divorce, exposing her lie. But then I realized something." He leaned forward slightly, his shackles clinking against the table. "Leaving would have freed her. She would have been relieved. She could have moved on, maybe even found Robert again, lived the life she actually wanted. Where was the justice in that?" My stomach turned as I understood what he was saying. "So you stayed to punish her." "I stayed to make sure she paid for her betrayal every single day. I stayed to make her life miserable. To break her down piece by piece until there was nothing left of the woman who dared to lie to me, to trap me in a marriage built on deception." There was no remorse in his voice, only justification. "And you were collateral damage, yes, but also evidence. Living, breathing proof of her betrayal. Every time I looked at you, I saw his face, his genes, her lie. So yes, I made you suffer too. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you existed as a reminder of her betrayal." The guard by the door shifted slightly, his expression carefully neutral, but I could tell he was listening to every word. "Do you understand what you're saying?" I asked quietly. "You're admitting you poisoned my mother, that you psychologically tortured both of us for years, that you murdered her rather than let her escape, and you're justifying it." Harold's jaw clenched. "I'm explaining it. There's a difference." "No," I said. "There isn't." He looked away, his hands curling into fists against the table despite the shackles. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with something I finally recognized as envy. "The thing that enraged me most wasn't your existence. It wasn't even your mother's betrayal, though that was bad enough. It was watching you succeed, despite everything I did to prevent it." He looked back at me, and the bitterness in his eyes was so raw it was almost painful to witness. "You built a life, a real life. You have a career you're good at, one where people respect you for your actual skills, not because they fear you or want something from you. You have friends who genuinely care about you, romantic partners who chose you because they wanted you, not because marrying you served some strategic purpose. You found authentic human connection, the kind of connection I've been chasing my entire life and never found." Harold's voice rose slightly, the bitterness sharpening into something more desperate. "Nobody has ever genuinely liked me, Diana. They feared me. They used me. They tolerated me because I had power or money or connections they needed. But like me, care about me as a person. Never. Not once in 72 years has anyone looked at me the way people look at you, with actual warmth, actual affection, actual respect that isn't tinged with fear or calculation. He leaned back, the fight seeming to drain out of him. Your mother died trapped in that house, trapped by the poison I fed her and the fear I cultivated. She never escaped. But you did. You got away. You're stronger than I ever was, more successful than I could ever be, more genuinely loved than I've been in my entire life. And you achieved all of that while carrying what I always considered the ultimate liability, being known as Harold Flores's daughter. I saw it then, finally, after 46 years. The truth that explained everything. Harold hadn't hated me because I reminded him of my mother's betrayal. He'd hated me because I represented everything he couldn't be. Authentic, loved for myself rather than what I could provide. Strong enough to walk away from toxicity rather than staying to control it. Capable of building real relationships rather than strategic alliances. I'd succeeded at being human in ways he'd never managed, and that success, more than anything else, had been unforgivable to him. Is that what you wanted to tell me? I asked. That you're jealous of your own daughter? I wanted you to understand why, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I wanted you to know it wasn't random cruelty. It was deliberate, calculated. I wanted to break you the way your mother was broken. I wanted to make sure you never found happiness or success or love. And I failed. That failure has eaten at me every day since you left 15 years ago. I stood up slowly. The guard straightened, ready to escort Harold back to his cell. Wait. Harold's voice cracked. Don't you have anything to say to me? Any final words before you walk away forever? I looked at him. This man who'd dominated my childhood, who'd murdered my mother, who'd tried to destroy Emily, who'd spent decades wielding cruelty like a weapon. He looked small now, powerless. Exactly what he'd always feared becoming. You didn't lose to me, Harold, I said clearly. You lost to yourself. You had a choice every single day to be better, to love, to change, to find genuine connection through authenticity rather than control. Instead, you chose cruelty. You chose manipulation. You chose to destroy rather than build. That's not on my mother. It's not on me. It's not on Emily. It's not on Robert Chen or anyone else you've blamed over the years. It's just on you. I moved toward the door and Harold made a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh. That's it. That's all you have to say. I turned back one final time. I forgive my mother for every choice she made, including the ones that led to my existence. I forgive Emily for taking time to find her strength. I even forgive myself for not understanding sooner what was happening. But I don't forgive you. Not because I'm holding a grudge, but because forgiveness would require remorse on your part, and you don't have any. You'll spend the rest of your life in a cell you built for yourself with your own choices. That's not punishment. That's consequences. I walked out. The heavy door closed behind me with a final echoing click. As I moved through the security checkpoints and out into the bright afternoon sunshine, my phone rang. Emily's name appeared on the screen. I answered, stepping away from the prison entrance into the fresh air that felt like freedom itself. Diana. Emily's voice was breathless, excited in a way I hadn't heard since before I'd known her. I need to tell you something wonderful. Diana. Emily's voice on the phone was different from any way I'd heard her speak before, not fearful or tentative or carefully controlled. She sounded free. I need to tell you something wonderful. I leaned against my car in the prison parking lot, letting the sunshine warm my face. Tell me. I'm still pregnant. The baby is healthy. I had an ultrasound yesterday and everything looks perfect. But Diana, there's something I never told you. Something I was too ashamed to admit even when I was confessing everything else. She took a breath, and I could hear the emotion in it. This baby isn't Harold's. I straightened, pressing the phone closer to my ear. I was already pregnant when Harold proposed 2 years ago, 3 months along. I'd been dating someone, Marcus, for about a year. He was kind and funny and worked as a teacher. We weren't ready for marriage, but we were happy. Then I found out I was pregnant, and he panicked, said he wasn't ready to be a father, that we were too young, that this wasn't part of his plan. He left, just completely left my life. Emily's voice cracked slightly. I felt so alone and ashamed. My parents are traditional. My mother would have been devastated that I was pregnant outside of marriage. I didn't know what to do. Then Harold appeared in my life, charming and attentive, and after a few weeks, I told him the truth. I thought he'd leave too. Instead, he said he'd marry me, give the baby his name, save me from scandal, and give my child a father. He made it seem noble, I said quietly. Exactly. He positioned himself as my savior, said he'd always wanted children, that it didn't matter who the biological father was, that he'd love this baby as his own. My parents were relieved their daughter would be married to a respectable older man instead of being a single mother. I thought I was so lucky. I thought Harold was rescuing me. Her voice hardened. But he wasn't rescuing me. He was trapping me. He used my pregnancy as leverage from day one. Every time I questioned him or pushed back on something, he'd remind me that he'd saved me, that I owed him, that without him my child would have been born into shame. He weaponized my gratitude. And the pregnancy gave him another control point. He could threaten to reveal the truth to my parents, to society, to make me look like a liar who'd trapped him into marriage. I felt tears on my face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition and relief. Emily, do you understand what this means? This baby has no biological connection to Harold, no genetic link to his cruelty. She's completely free of him. I know. Emily's voice broke. I know, and Diana, I can't tell you what that means to me. When I found out I was pregnant, part of me was terrified that this child would carry his DNA, his predisposition to cruelty, his capacity for manipulation. But she doesn't. She's mine, just mine. And she'll grow up knowing her mother was strong enough to leave, brave enough to tell the truth, and that she was never, ever part of Harold's legacy. We both cried for a moment, the phone line carrying our shared relief and joy. Where will you go? I asked finally. What's your plan? My mother's sister lives in Portland, Oregon. Aunt Linda, she's always been the family rebel, never married, runs a bookshop, has been telling me for years that I should leave Harold. She doesn't know the full story yet, but she's offered me a place to stay as long as I need it. I'm going to take her up on it. Get as far away from New York and Harold's sphere of influence as possible. That sounds perfect, I said. And Emily, I'll help you with whatever you need. Moving costs, legal fees, setting up a new life. You won't be alone. Thank you. Her voice was thick with emotion. And Diana, I want to name her Catherine, after your mother. The woman who tried to warn us all, who left evidence to protect you, who understood what it meant to be trapped, but hoped someone else could be free. I want my daughter to carry that legacy, not Harold's cruelty, but your mother's courage. I couldn't speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the gesture. My mother would have loved that, I finally managed. And she would have loved you. We talked for another 20 minutes, making plans. Emily wanted to open a small bakery, eventually learn to actually cook and bake on her own terms for the joy of it rather than as a performance. She talked about taking classes, about the freedom of being able to make mistakes without punishment, about teaching her daughter that food made with love doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a while, processing everything. The conversation with Harold, Emily's revelation about the baby, the sense that chapters were closing and new ones beginning. That evening, after I'd returned home and made myself tea, real tea, not the kind Harold had used to poison my mother, I checked my email and found a message from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "From Robert Chen, please read when ready." My hand trembled as I opened it. Dear Diana, my name is Robert Chen. though you may know me by now as the man your mother loved before Harold Flores entered her life. I am writing to you with news that may shock you, but I hope will ultimately bring some measure of peace. I am your biological father. I know this is an overwhelming revelation, and I owe you an explanation for my absence from your life. Your mother and I were deeply in love 46 years ago. We planned to marry, but her family had other plans they'd promised her to Harold, who was older, established from the right social circles. Robert Chen, the son of immigrants still building his career, was not acceptable. Your mother was already pregnant with you when her family forced the marriage to Harold. We thought we could keep it secret, that Harold would never know. For 3 years it seemed we'd succeeded. But when you were 3, Harold discovered the truth through a hospital blood test. He called me, threatened me, said if I didn't leave the country and never contact Catherine again, he would harm all 3 of you. He had connections to dangerous people. This wasn't an empty threat. Your mother begged me to go. She said it was the only way to keep you safe, that Harold's rage would eventually cool, but only if I disappeared completely. So I did. I moved to California, built a new life. But I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped loving your mother. And I've watched your life from afar all these years. Your achievements, your strength, your compassion. You are so much like her. When I saw Harold's arrest on the news, when I heard about your mother's recording and understood she'd been murdered, I knew it was finally safe to reach out. Harold can't hurt any of us anymore. I'm not writing to claim you as my daughter or demand a relationship. You've lived your entire life without me, and I have no right to disrupt that. But if you're willing, I would very much like to meet you. To tell you about your mother as she was before Harold, when she was young and full of dreams. To answer any questions you might have. To simply know you if you'll allow it. I understand if you need time or if you prefer not to respond at all. But please know that you were wanted. You were loved. And your existence is not the product of betrayal or shame, but of genuine love between 2 people who wanted to build a life together. With hope and respect. Robert Chen. I read the email 3 times, each word settling into my understanding of who I was and where I came from. I wasn't Harold's daughter. I never had been. I was the child of 2 people who'd loved each other genuinely, who'd been torn apart by circumstance and Harold's cruelty. As I was composing a reply, my phone rang. Emily again. Diana? Her voice was breathless, shocked. There's someone at my door. A man. He says he's your father. Robert Chen. He's here. What do I? I'll be right there, I said, already grabbing my keys. Don't let him leave. 1 year later, I hosted another Christmas dinner. The house looked similar, garlands on the manteltree, glowing in the corner, candles on every surface. But everything else was different. The air felt lighter, warmer, as if the walls themselves remembered last year's trauma and were grateful for this year's peace. Emily arrived first, carrying 6-month-old Catherine in a carrier strapped to her chest. The transformation in Emily was stunning. Her hair was shorter now, cut in a style she'd chosen herself. She wore comfortable jeans and a sweater, no designer labels or carefully curated outfit. But most remarkably, she was smiling genuinely, freely, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and made her whole face light up. I made pie, she announced, holding up a slightly lopsided dessert with obvious pride. It's not perfect, the crust is uneven, and I think I overmixed the filling, but I made it myself. No one standing behind me criticizing. No cameras, no performance. Just me in my aunt's kitchen, following a recipe and making mistakes and learning. I took the pie like it was precious treasure. It's beautiful. Baby Catherine, we called her Cat, gurgled happily from her carrier. She had Emily's eyes and a head of dark hair that stuck up in all directions. She was healthy, thriving, and completely unaware that she'd been born into freedom rather than the trap Harold had prepared for her. Robert arrived next, carrying a box of old photographs. My relationship with him was still tentative, still developing, but growing warmer. We'd met dozens of times over the past year, coffee lunch long walks where we tried to catch up on 46 years of missed life. He told me about my mother as she'd been before Harold, and I'd told him about the woman I remembered. Together, we were building a picture of Catherine Flores that was whole and complex and real. "I brought pictures," he said, settling onto my couch and opening the box. "Your mother at 22 before she ever met Harold. I thought you should see her this way." The photos showed a woman I barely recognized but somehow knew intimately. My mother, young and radiant, laughing at the camera with unguarded joy, dancing at what looked like a street festival, reading in a park completely absorbed in her book. Every photo showed someone free, undiminished, fully herself. "She was so beautiful," I whispered. "She was," Robert agreed. "And you look so much like her." Other guests began arriving, women from Catherine's Kitchen, the community center I'd opened 6 months ago using the settlement from Harold's estate. The center offered free cooking classes for women recovering from domestic abuse, a safe space where they could learn to prepare food without fear of criticism or punishment, where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than reasons for humiliation. The idea had come from something my mother once told me, captured in one of her later journal entries that Robert had kept. "I always dreamed of teaching cooking classes. Not fancy cuisine, just simple, nourishing food. Helping women find joy in feeding their families, in feeding themselves. Making the kitchen a place of love rather than fear." Now that dream was real. Catherine's Kitchen served 50 women a week, teaching them not just cooking skills, but confidence, community, and the radical notion that they deserve to take up space and make mistakes and learn without punishment. Several of my students had come tonight bringing dishes they'd made, some perfect, some decidedly not, all of them made with pride and joy. As we gathered around the table, I looked at the scene before me and felt my chest tighten with emotion. Emily was teaching cat patty cake while juggling a casserole dish. Robert was showing photos to one of my students, explaining who my mother had been. Aunt Marie was there with Uncle Tom, both of them visibly relieved to be at a family gathering with no underlying tension. Several other relatives had come too, the ones who'd witnessed last year's disaster and wanted to be part of this year's healing. No one was performing, no one was afraid, no one was walking on eggshells or bracing for criticism. People laughed, genuinely interrupted each other, with affection reached across the table without asking permission. The food was imperfect. Some dishes over-seasoned, others slightly burned. Emily's pie definitely lopsided. But it was all made with love, and that made it perfect in ways Harold would never have understood. As we prepared to eat, I stood and raised my glass. Everyone quieted, looking at me expectantly. I thought about my mother, who'd spent her final months recording evidence and planting seeds of justice she'd never lived to see grow. I thought about Emily, who'd been brave enough to document her abuse and strong enough to walk away. I thought about Harold spending life in prison, finally facing consequences for decades of cruelty. I thought about baby Kat growing up free of the legacy that had tried to claim her. "Thank you, Mom," I said quietly, looking at the photos Robert had brought at my mother's young, free face. "We made it." Then I looked around the table at all these people who'd survived, who'd fought, who'd chosen healing over hatred. "Let's eat," I said, and my smile was genuine and uncomplicated. "Tonight, the food tastes like freedom." And it did. Harold Flores is currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was convicted on all charges: first-degree murder, fraud, blackmail, coercive control, and domestic violence. Emily has built a beautiful life in Portland with her daughter Catherine, who just turned 18 months old. She opened her bakery last spring, and it's become a community gathering place where imperfection is celebrated and mistakes are part of the learning process. Robert and I have dinner together every Sunday, slowly building the father-daughter relationship we were denied for 46 years. And Catherine's Kitchen continues to grow, helping dozens of women every month reclaim their relationship with food, with themselves, and with their own strength. My mother didn't live to see justice served, but her voice from beyond the grave made sure the truth finally came out. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is leave evidence plant seeds and trust that someone will water them when the time is right. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another true story. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone finally escape a toxic situation? What gave them the strength to leave? Or if you've experienced something similar, what helped you find your freedom? Your stories matter, and sharing them helps others recognize the signs and find the courage to act. Thank you for listening, and remember, the truth always has power even when it takes years to emerge.